Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Emily Godest. On the evening of November 9, 2007, Johan and Emily were driving on a small country road in Châtenay, France. It was a typical trip for them until he noticed a large dark object suddenly darting across the road. He reacted, but he wasn't quick enough. The car skidded into a ditch and crashed into a tree. After the collision, Johan tried to help his girlfriend, Emily. The car was damaged and caught fire. She was engulfed in flames and fell to the ground, suffering severe injuries that left almost half of her body burned beyond recognition. Despite her condition, she was still alive, so he immediately called for emergency services and waited for the paramedics and police to arrive. While Emily suffered life-threatening injuries, Johan only had minor injuries. Emergency services quickly arrived at the scene. Emily was a history student with dreams of becoming a teacher. She was known for her bright and sociable personality, and she came from a wealthy family with 3 brothers and 1 sister. Her father often indulged her every wish. At midnight, Emily's father was informed about the accident involving her. He rushed to the hospital, where he found her in critical condition and on life support. The fire had severely burned her. The medical staff had to cut away her clothing in pieces, and the doctors could not predict her chances of survival. In conversation with the police, Johan quickly described the incident. He explained that they was on her way to a party in a nearby town that evening. He seeing a dark figure that looked like a wild boar suddenly run into the headlights, causing the accident. After their car crashed into a tree, he lost consciousness briefly and felt disoriented. When he regained awareness, he saw flames rising from the girl's head and spreading to her back. She was focused on escaping from the vehicle and did not notice him. When Johan ran out of the car to assist her, he found that she had already gotten outside. Meanwhile, the fire seemed to grow stronger. He grabbed a nearby bottle of water to try to extinguish the flames, but it was ineffective. Next, he tried using a fire extinguisher from the trunk, but it did not work. Johan took off his jacket and used it to smother the flames on Emily. In the end, he was able to put out the fire by covering her with his body to cut off the oxygen supply. Johan's explanation seemed credible, and the police found evidence at the accident site that looked like clumps of earth disturbed by an animal. It's likely that the headlights startled a wild boar, which attempted to cross the road and caused the accident. Nearby the burned vehicle, officers found a fire extinguisher with a broken nozzle, which accounted for its failure to work, supporting Johan's claims. However, it was still unclear why the fire started inside the vehicle. Although the accident was severe enough to ignite a fire, the fuel tank was unharmed, indicating that fuel couldn't have caused the fire, and the wiring appeared intact, making it unlikely that an electrical spark ignited it. There was a reason for what happened. Johan explained that earlier that day, he and his girlfriend had bought medical alcohol for cleaning and refueling equipment in the garage. He planned to clean the car's interior before selling it. He worked in a printing house where he regularly handled various chemicals. To avoid mistakes, he had developed a habit of checking the contents of chemical containers by opening them and smelling them. He believed that if the bottles had not been sealed properly, the liquids could have spilled during the accident and ignited. Before the crash, Johan noticed something glowing in his girlfriend's hands, which he thought might have been a lighter or a cell phone, but he wasn't sure. He believed that this glow could have ignited the spilled liquids. He considered the tragedy a result of unfortunate circumstances and insisted it was an accident. However, his girlfriend was still in intensive care, and the police felt it was unfair to attribute such serious damage solely to chance. As a result, detectives decided to investigate Johan further to see if he had any criminal history or tendencies toward violence. Suspecting there might have been some malicious intent in his actions, Johan was a 22-year-old worker at a printing house in Gonesse, France. He was known for being polite, conscientious, and always willing to help others. Friends and family regarded him as a model son and a dependable friend. At the time of the tragic events, He had been in a relationship with Emily for about 4 years. They had met when she was 16 and just starting her senior year of high school, while he was 2 years older. From the start, they had ambitious plans for their future, discussing the possibility of starting a family and having children. However, they were in no rush. Their plan was to first complete their education, secure good jobs, find a place to live, and only then consider starting a family. Their loved ones supported these goals, and despite their youth, they had a serious outlook on life. During college, they spent a lot of time together, often staying overnight at each other's homes. A few months before the accident, they got engaged, and Johann gave Emily a ring. They intended to move in together, and everything seemed to indicate that he was the perfect partner. The police decided to wait until dawn to investigate the scene more thoroughly. As the sun rose, the officers began to examine the area and question Johann's account of the accident. Although it was indeed an accident, they found no evidence of braking, suggesting that he may have crashed into the tree without slowing down. They suggested that the car had approached at a low speed and crashed into the tree on the passenger side, which likely explains why the driver did not incur serious injuries. The idea of wild boar tracks was deemed less credible. In daylight, the roadside was full of debris, and it was possible that the car's headlights had created confusion about the objects present. However, it appeared more like a staged incident. Experts who examined the car for flammable substances found that the fire did not start from underneath the vehicle. The lower area of the car near the driver's and passenger's feet did not sustain the damage expected in that situation. Johann claimed that alcohol or white spirit might have spilled, igniting the flames. Emily suffered the most severe burns on her head and back, suggesting that the fire started from above her seat rather than from below. In contrast, her legs were nearly untouched, which contradicted Johann's statements and raised concerns for the police. Forensic analysis of Emily's clothing revealed that it was nearly saturated with alcohol or a similar flammable liquid. This suggested that the fire did not originate from the cabin. Rather, it appeared that Emily had been doused with a flammable substance. This raised questions about how she could have been covered in medical alcohol or white spirit, while her boyfriend remained completely clean. Johann had no injuries at all, which deepened the mystery. It seems possible that an incident occurred that only affected Emily. If she had accidentally spilled a bottle of medical alcohol, Johann would likely have sustained burns or injuries from the fire. Instead, he escaped with only minor scratches from hitting a tree. Emily remained in critical condition, and the police believed that a deliberate crime was the most plausible explanation. Evidence suggested that the incident was staged. Emily had likely been intentionally doused with a medical alcohol and set on fire. The only remaining question was the motive behind it. However, these were merely assumptions that required further investigation. Emily's testimony was crucial, as she was the only witness who could answer all the police's questions. Unfortunately, she was in an induced coma, and the doctors had not provided a clear prognosis. After 5 weeks, she finally woke up, but her condition was weak, and her body was largely incapacitated, requiring a long recovery. Emily had sustained severe injuries that left her unable to move properly. Her left leg was unresponsive, and her arms had limited mobility. However, her cognitive functions were intact, allowing her to communicate fully with the detectives, who were eager to speak with her. During their first conversation, Emily spoke fondly of her boyfriend, describing their relationship as one of pure and sincere love. Johann had always been attentive and well-mannered. However, due to her time in the coma, Emily had significant gaps in her memory. She confirmed most of Johann's account of events, but she could not remember anything after he saw a shadow run onto the road. The doctors believed these memory gaps were a result of the coma and that Emily would need time to gradually recover her memories. Further discussions with the police were unproductive, and they would have to wait for her to regain more information. In the following weeks, while Emily was still hospitalized, Johann visited her several times a day. During each visit, he repeated his story, which started to sound increasingly suspicious. It seemed he was trying to manipulate her memories so she wouldn't recall what really happened. He pressured her to relay his version of events to the authorities, claiming it was essential to secure insurance payouts for the car. However, as Emily spent more time in the hospital, her memory began to improve. She started to notice inconsistencies in her boyfriend's account, especially rejecting the idea that an animal had been on the road. Emily mentioned that she had initially repeated Johann's story because he had convinced her it was true. However, she could not remember any wild boars on the road. Instead, she distinctly recalled the tree they crashed into before the fire started. At this time, her memory was still not fully restored. The detectives decided to interview Johann again to investigate his potential lies about the animals. He continued to stand by his original story, while Emily grew increasingly uneasy with his presence. She lost all trust in him and began to side with the police regarding his possible involvement in the accident. In June 2008, Johann chose to end his engagement with his fiancée, who was still in the hospital and unable to care for herself. In late June 2008, Emily had regained her memory and was able to provide the authorities with a new account of that tragic evening. In her statement, she portrayed Johann, whom she had once loved, as a cruel tyrant and manipulator. Emily revealed that throughout their relationship, she had endured both emotional and physical abuse from him. Johann had attempted to isolate her from her friends and family, controlling every aspect of her life. She felt trapped and was afraid to leave him, fearing he would retaliate. It was a vicious cycle that needed to be broken. Just before that evening, she and Johann were driving together when another argument broke out. The girl tried to express her feelings, which only fueled her boyfriend's anger. In that moment, she revealed that she wanted to end their relationship. Johann, filled with rage, began to speed up the car. The speedometer climbed past 130 kilometers per hour, and Emily became frightened, begging him to slow down. She remembered this moment with terror, realizing she was genuinely worried for her safety. Although Emily eventually calmed Johann down and he reduced his speed, she was left with a lingering fear that if she attempted to break up with him, he might react violently. Emily felt that their once beautiful love story had turned into a nightmare of manipulation. Unsure of what to do for a long time, she eventually met another young man. They had secret meetings, and she began to gather her thoughts to prepare for a calm breakup with Johann. Emily recalled that on the evening of the tragedy, she needed to attend a reunion with her high school friends in Goussainville. Although she wanted to go to the party alone, Johann insisted on accompanying her. As they drove toward the city, Johann missed the first exit from the highway and then the second. Emily realized he wasn't taking her to the friends' meeting. He might have suspected her of meeting someone else. Instead, he was heading to his hometown. Emily didn't want to go with him and began to protest. This was the same road where Johann had scared her by speeding just before these events. Now, he was doing it again. Emily saw the tree he was heading toward at high speed, and he didn't even try to brake. She understood that a collision was unavoidable, and it indeed occurred. Fortunately, both of them survived the car accident. Emily attempted to escape from him but struggled to open the passenger door. When she finally managed to get it open, she was unexpectedly engulfed in flames. Confused and in excruciating pain, she tried to extinguish the fire but collapsed to the ground. Suddenly, she felt pressure on her face. Emily told the detective that she saw Johann trying to strangle her with his leather jacket, which contradicted his claim that he was attempting to put out the fire. This led to the suggestion that Johann was trying to kill his fiancée. Ultimately, Emily lost consciousness and woke up in a hospital bed several weeks later. After recalling these events, she filed a report for attempted murder. Although Emily's family portrayed Johann positively, her concerns about him began to surface. Detectives interviewed Eloise, a co-worker of Emily's at the cash register, Eloise recalled that Johann exhibited erratic behavior. He called Emily daily, sometimes multiple times an hour, and frequently stalked her. He would become very upset if she didn't answer right away. Since Emily was busy at work, she couldn't always talk on the phone, but Johann disregarded this. His jealousy was intense. If Emily missed his calls, he would often show up at the supermarket and cause a scene, suspecting her of infidelity. Eloise confirmed that Emily had expressed her unhappiness about Johann's behavior several months before the car accident, leading her to consider breaking up with him. To gather more evidence, the police checked Johann's mobile phone and found that it had been at the Goussainville station one day before the incident. Emily traveled to this station daily for classes at a nearby school, close to where her new boyfriend lived. They often met during her commutes to and from college. It was revealed that Johann had witnessed another encounter between Emily and her new boyfriend, during which she had kissed him. This incident likely fueled Johann's jealousy and manipulation, which may have contributed to his decision to confront Emily. At this time, investigators found a motive that prompted Johann to take action. The key questions were how the fire started. It seems Johann did not plan to kill himself along with Emily. Instead, he intended to make it look like an accident, with the fire aimed at harming her. When he realized that Emily had not suffered serious injuries from the crash and that her burns were not life-threatening, he opted to strangle her with his leather jacket. Emily lost consciousness, and Johann mistakenly believed he had succeeded, so he called emergency services. However, he did not anticipate that Emily would survive and regain consciousness. Despite this, the investigators still lacked sufficient evidence to file charges, leading the police to conduct a more thorough investigation. During this time, the burned car was at the junkyard, where an expert in flammable materials and fire safety was summoned. After a brief search, they found a plastic bottle with alcohol residue under the driver's seat. The expert indicated that this was evidence of the fuel that Johann used to set Emily on fire. At the time, Emily was desperately trying to escape through the door and did not notice what Johann was doing. He took advantage of her distraction and confusion. After pouring the alcohol on Emily's dress, he casually placed the bottle by his feet near the driver's seat. Authorities found this sequence of events much more believable than Johann's account. They now had the murder weapon, a regular plastic bottle containing a highly flammable substance. On January 7, 2009, Johann was arrested and taken into custody. Despite the detectives' repeated efforts to get him to confess, he stuck to his story. He asserted that he had no mental health issues or addictions, nor did he have tendencies toward end his life or cruelty. Claims that were corroborated by several witnesses who knew him and Emily. Johann acknowledged that he felt jealous but denied the accusations that he had tormented Emily for months. He believed she was trying to take revenge for their breakup. Johann confirmed that he had been at the Goussainville station, but stated that he did not see Emily meeting or kissing other guys. He was there not to stalk her but to give her a ride to school when he could. Johann maintained that if he had seen her kissing someone else, he would have confronted her immediately, making a breakup unavoidable. He remained loyal to Emily until the very end, and was committed to the dream of having a complete family with her. The reason Johann passed the turn several times and ended up on a remote stretch of road away from Goussainville was a common habit. He liked to take detours when going into town. There were also concerns about an alcohol bottle found at his feet. Johann argued that this bottle did not indicate he had used substances for arson. He suggested that it could have rolled around the cabin during the incident and that its placement under the seat was purely coincidental. Despite the plausibility of his words, the detectives were frustrated by these coincidences, especially since they nearly resulted in Emily's death. In the end, Johann was incarcerated. It appeared that the investigation was wrapping up and the focus was now on determining his punishment and persuading the jury of the charges against him. However, in June 2009, A previously overlooked detail came to light that raised doubts about the prosecution's case. Johann's attorney demonstrated that the alcohol in the bottle found under the driver's seat did not match the size of the chemicals Johann had purchased on the day of the accident. From the start, the defense attorney believed the bottle was not a legitimate murder weapon and argued that the gendarmes had made a significant error. They overlooked the fact that the bottle could not have survived the fire that nearly took Emily's life. Since it originally held a flammable substance, it should have burned or melted, yet miraculously, it remained almost intact. The lawyer argued that the bottle only appeared in the car after it was taken to the dump, implying that someone had placed it there. The defense lodged a complaint in court, accusing the police of fabricating evidence against Johann. In response, the prosecution explained the bottle's condition by noting that the area around the feet of the driver and passenger sustained minimal damage. The judge reviewed the motion, found it valid, and subsequently released the accused from custody. Even after this victory, the lawyer continued his pursuit of justice. He took further steps to establish his client's innocence, firmly believing that the events of November 9, 2007 were purely accidental. To support his case, an independent accident expert was to reconstruct the incident. It was essential to clarify how the fire began and why only Emily was affected. According to the expert, the bottle of technical alcohol was indeed in the rear seat, as Johann had stated, and the victim must have had the container propelled forward due to the impact speed with the dashboard. The bottle likely ricocheted, and if the cap was not securely fastened, the alcohol would have splattered on the driver or passenger. Emily was simply unfortunate. The bottle moved toward her, dousing her in alcohol, and in her confusion, she did not realize what had happened before catching fire. The reconstructed path of the bottle matched exactly with the most severely burned areas on the girl's body, particularly her back and the back of her head, aligning with the expert's findings. Additionally, that part of the road was poorly lit, which meant that in the dark, the driver might have confused any random object on the roadside for an animal due to the headlights. There were several large objects scattered around, making the theory of an accident seem plausible. Moreover, since the passenger was positioned at a different angle, she might not have noticed the fleeting shadow that Johann thought was a wild boar. The only element that didn't fit this scenario was the source of the fire that ignited the alcohol. However, the independent expert had a reasonable explanation for this. He suggested that the spark could have been caused by a combination of factors. For example, static electricity might have built up on one of Emily's belongings, like her mobile phone, and discharged when she opened the vehicle door. By mid-January 2017, 10 years had passed, and the legal disputes were still ongoing. The prosecution's evidence was not strong enough to prove that Johann's actions were intentional. Meanwhile, the explanations involving multiple coincidences also lacked credibility, leaving the case unresolved. A standoff developed between the prosecution and the defense. June 2019, Emily testified in court about how Johann had tried to kill her, and she miraculously survived. Now she could finally share the whole truth. 12 years after the tragedy, the jurors sentenced Johann to 20 years in prison, concluding that Emily was a victim of his deliberate attempt to murder her. Johann continues to claim his innocence, and the disputes persist. What really happened? Was it an accident or an attempted crime? Regardless, all the characters in this tragedy continue to live. Emily underwent several skin grafts and was able to recover from her injuries. She completed her education and found a good job. The scars from the burns she suffered in the car accident will remain with her forever, as will her belief that Johann intended to take her life. Hello everyone. Today we will learn about another case, the case of Susan Bailey. Susan was born in 1965 in a small town in Minnesota, USA. She was an ordinary, carefree girl who easily made friends and was sociable. Partly due to having many siblings, her parents had 4 children in total. Susan was smart, did well in school, and was responsible and non-confrontational. From a young age, her parents taught her the importance of independence and hard work. After graduating from high school, Susan enrolled in a local college. To avoid burdening her parents financially while paying for her education, she took a job as a saleswoman. It seemed like everything was falling into place for her. However, she never enjoyed the cold and gray weather of Minnesota and dreamed of moving south. After completing her studies, she decided to relocate to another state. This decision led Susan to the sunny beaches of California, fulfilling her childhood dream. There, she quickly found a job in retail and met a man, Mr. Bailey, who would become her husband. He was calm and reserved, pursuing a military career. They married in 1988. Although Susan's family disapproved of her choice due to the challenges of Mr. Bailey's profession, they ultimately accepted her decision. In the following years, they moved several times because of her husband's military service. While he worked, Susan spent most of her time at home and felt unhappy with this lifestyle. However, he promised to leave the military after his contract ended, which he did in 1990. They then returned to California, and Susan decided to become pregnant with their first child, a girl named Jennifer. 4 years later, they welcomed another child. They chose to focus on their careers to support their growing family. During this time, Susan found success in her retail career and became the primary breadwinner, while her husband struggled in his job. They switched roles, with him taking on the role of a stay-at-home dad, and Susan working to provide for the family. This change was made possible when Susan accepted a job with a new clothing company. In 1997, she was promoted to regional manager of Texas, which came with significant responsibilities. Susan realized she couldn't turn down this opportunity. She and the children relocated to Texas, where they decided to settle in a small town called Denton. In 2000, the Bailey family purchased a house with 4 bedrooms, a living room, and a separate playroom in the small town. It seemed like a perfect place for a peaceful family life. As Susan became part of the local community, she met her neighbors. They had children of school age and lived across the street. They spent a lot of time together, discussing local news. However, Susan later discovered something troubling. Whenever Jennifer visited the neighbor, she would leave with items in her hands. After these visits, the neighboring family noticed that money and belongings were missing, leading them to suspect that Jennifer was stealing. Despite this, her neighbor never brought up her concerns with Susan, possibly thinking that Susan was too busy with work and did not want to burden her with additional problems. As a result, the relationship with the neighbors became strained. Susan's son David faced several challenges. He struggled with bedwetting, which required her to change the bedding nearly every day, causing her stress. Additionally, David had behavioral issues and frequently got into trouble. However, these problems were minor compared to the bankruptcy of Susan's company, which led to her losing her job and significant income, severely impacting their family. At that time, she had started her own small cosmetic shop, but it did not compensate for the loss of her managerial position in a large firm. Eventually, she found work at another clothing store, but her new salary was much lower than her previous earnings. During this period, Susan realized her independence, while her husband struggled to find a job to support her. Their relationship became strained, and by 2006, they officially divorced. It remains unclear why her husband did not take any initiative to fight for custody of their children or their assets. He simply left everything to Susan without hesitation and agreed to pay child support. Susan was struggling with her own problems as well as those of her son and daughter, and everything seemed to be getting worse. For the first time, she felt overwhelmed by her new responsibilities. At the same time, she had to work 2 jobs to keep the family financially stable and avoid debt. This left her with little time to spend with her children. Susan was hardly ever home, and the children felt neglected. David was falling behind in school, skipping classes, and even resorting to self-harm in an attempt to get his mother's attention. His sister Jennifer take care of him, but she felt uncomfortable in that role and wanted to enjoy her own life instead. She often expressed her frustration about this. During this time, Jennifer met a boy named Paul Henson, who was a year younger than her. He lived with his family in a trailer park. Paul mentioned that he came from a troubled family, which resonated with Jennifer as she could relate to his struggles. However, Paul was quite unusual. He believed he had 2 distinct personalities. He described one of his 2 personalities as a reincarnation of a 10th century executioner, referring to it as his evil alter ego. Many of his classmates noticed Paul talking to himself, conversing with imaginary people and speaking in languages no one understood. He spent most of his free time playing fantasy computer games. Despite his unusual behavior, Paul genuinely liked Jennifer, and they started dating. Jennifer thought his eccentricities were just a product of his vivid imagination and gradually began to share his interests, playing the same games and acting oddly. For instance, they wore dog collars with each other's names. They also engaged in dark mystical practices, which eventually led to a love triangle. Paul revealed to Jennifer that one of his personalities was fond of her, while another personality of his had feelings for a girl named Marilee. Marilee was a 14-year-old from a wealthy family who appeared naive and impressionable. Marilee and Jennifer both fell under his influence, believing they all had mutual feelings for each other, leading to a complicated emotional situation. Susan Bailey strongly disliked Paul from the start and encouraged her daughter to end her relationship with the unusual Paul. However, Jennifer refused to heed her family's warnings. As a result, both their relationship and the home environment worsened quickly. Despite being told not to communicate with Paul, Jennifer was seen with him during the day when all the adults were home. Additionally, Jennifer regularly ignored her mother's requests regarding her schoolwork, chores, and taking care of David. Jennifer got a job at a fast food restaurant, which meant she was hardly ever home. This worried Susan, as David was often left unsupervised. To help, Susan's parents agreed to take David in for the month of July. During this time, they noticed an improvement in his behavior. They taught him household chores and introduced him to activities like fishing. However, they also observed some concerning behavior when David threw a tantrum in the car after his grandparents refused to buy him something on a whim. He rocked the car back and forth in frustration but calmed down as soon as they got home. This incident made his grandmother realize that David was struggling with emotional issues. Determined to help David, his grandparents began taking him to various doctors and clinics. His grandmother wanted him to stay longer so they could address his problems, but Susan was reluctant to let him stay for too long. Eventually, she bought a ticket and insisted that David return home. When he did, he surprised his mother and sister with his good behavior, and even brought Jennifer a small gift. At this point, Susan had been considering buying a car for Jennifer to make her commute to work easier, but Susan realized she didn't have enough money. Jennifer was unhappy about this and insisted she needed a car for convenience. Her mother asked her to be patient. A month later, Susan was shocked to receive a bill for the children's phone services that totaled $1,500. She found out that Jennifer had been spending all her free time talking to Paul, while David was frequently online, which led to high charges. Susan explained to her children that this was unacceptable and urged them to reduce their phone usage. Shortly after, Susan received a notification that Jennifer had spent an additional $200 on phone calls. Furious and already facing financial difficulties, Susan confronted Jennifer. who claimed that her paycheck had been delayed and that she intended to cover the costs herself. At that point, Susan decided to contact the restaurant where Jennifer worked to inquire about the delay in her daughter's pay. For the past month and a half, Jennifer had not shown up for work, so there was no paycheck for her. This shocked Susan, who realized that Jennifer had been dishonest. Instead of working, she had been spending time with her boyfriend. The next day, Susan at work, leaving David home alone, wandering around the courtyard of the house without clothes, which scared the neighbors. At that moment, Susan understood that she had lost control over her children and felt powerless to change things. To support the family, she had to work all the time. By the end of September, the situation had worsened. Jennifer decided to take advantage of her mother's constant work schedule. She started inviting Paul and Marilee over to the guest room, where her father used to live, spending time with them while Susan was away. When Susan was home, they acted like good guests, but as soon as she left, they behaved rudely. David was aware of everything but kept it a secret from Susan, supporting his sister and her friends. Eventually, they all grew tired of their parents' restrictions on their lives. This frustration led to a dangerous plan to kill Jennifer's mothers and Marilee's mothers, as well as Paul's parents. The trio became involved in various criminal ideas, including poisoning Susan with crushed prescription pills or arranging for her to be electrocuted in the bath. They also considered using a baseball bat, knives to cause serious injury. Paul even thought about shooting his father and stepmother, while Marilee planned to stab her mother while she slept. In the final phase of their plan, the teenagers intended to steal Susan's car, take their parents' money, and escape to Canada. On September 22, 2008, 14-year-old Marilee White had been missing for several days and had not answered her phone. Concerned, her mother reported her daughter as missing. Marilee's friends were also unable to contact her. Marilee's mother took action by distributing flyers with Marilee's photo and contacting the police. Fortunately, a patrol found Marilee wandering aimlessly on the outskirts of town and brought her home. During this time, Marilee revealed that Paul, a friend, had abandoned her. The police persuaded her not to run away again, and it appeared that she had calmed down. However, on the morning of September 23, 2008, Marilee's mother woke up feeling a strange presence. When she opened her eyes, she saw Marilee standing over her bed with a large kitchen knife. Instead of attacking, she reacted defensively as Marilee demanded the car keys to drive to the Bailey family's house. Marilee planned to gather others and escape to Canada. Although she reluctantly gave her the keys, she prevented Marilee from leaving. As soon as Marilee stepped outside, she called the police. Authorities intercepted Marilee and took her to a juvenile detention center. There, Marilee told her cellmate about a plan to kill their parents, but nobody took her seriously. At this time, Paul Henson waited for his father and stepmother to leave their trailer in the morning to go shopping. He broke into his father's room and took his .22 caliber handgun. He intended to shoot them when they returned, but they unexpectedly stopped at a movie theater and then went to visit friends, which delayed him return. Frustrated by the wait, Paul decided to leave and went back to Susan's house. That evening, Marilee was released from custody, and at the same time, Paul's parents reported him missing. The next day, September 24, David took a large knife with him to school. When the school administration learned about it, they issued a written warning to his mother. Susan put the warning on the refrigerator, but was too busy to address it right away. The following day, a police officer approached her to inform her about the search for Paul Henson, suggesting he might be at their house. Although she couldn't find him there, she noticed clear signs that he had been visiting frequently. The detective asked for permission to enter the house and talk to Jennifer, and she agreed. From the beginning, Jennifer seemed nervous. The detective knew about the teenager's deceptive plan and decided to ask Jennifer, where Paul was. She said she hadn't seen her boyfriend since Saturday. The detective then requested to speak with her alone, but her mother, Susan, refused. Suspecting that Paul might be hiding in the house, the detective asked to search the premises, but Susan denied the request, stating that a warrant was needed. As a result, the detective left without any new information. The search for Paul continued, and another police officer arrived at the Bailey home. This time, Susan was informed that there were reports suggesting Paul might have a missing .22 caliber pistol from his father's trailer. Worried about safety, she reluctantly allowed the search, although she was not happy about it. During the search, they found several suspicious items, including a large butcher knife, hidden under a couch cushion in the living room. Since the knife did not belong to the Baileys, Susan accused Jennifer of planning to run away with Paul again. Jennifer explained that her friend might have accidentally left his knife at her house during his last visit, but this explanation did not convince Susan. Without waiting for the police to leave, Susan started arguing with her daughter again. Susan threatened to send her to live with her father or grandparents. During a search of Jennifer's room, they found evidence that she was packing her belongings. They also discovered several knives, which raised suspicions. However, since they couldn't find Paul's gun, the police left the house. Later, the mother found a box of ammunition hidden in one of the suitcases and became worried. She called the police again, requesting a more thorough search of her home. When they returned, the police took the ammunition but still did not find a gun. Instead, they found even more knives scattered around the house. In the trash, they found an empty bottle of antidepressants that belonged to Marilee. The Bailey family did not use such medications, but the police were unaware of this girl at the time and overlooked these concerning signs. Paul's father arrived at the house anxious about his son. He packed up Paul's belongings and left with everyone else. The following day, Susan struggled to find a way to resolve issues with her children, but nothing seemed to work. On September 25, she went to her regular job, followed by her second job, finally finishing around midnight. Throughout the day, Susan tried to contact her children, but both ignored her calls and messages. When she got home, she immediately sensed that something was off. The lights were off. Inside, she discovered the usual chaos left by her children. As she moved upstairs in the darkness, the house felt eerily quiet. As Susan climbed the stairs, someone suddenly grabbed her by the neck and covered her mouth with a cloth that had a chemical smell. Just then, Jennifer, Paul, and David stepped out of the shadows. They quickly slit Susan's throat and began stabbing her repeatedly with knives until she lay motionless on the floor within minutes. However, this horrific act was only part of their sinister plan. On September 26, Susan's mother received multiple calls from worried colleagues about Susan, as she had not shown up for her shifts that morning, a surprising behavior for someone who was known to be a workaholic. Susan's mother made several attempts to contact Susan, but was unsuccessful. Eventually, she reached out to the police department in Roanoke, Texas, asking them to check on the Bailey family's home. Over the next 2 days, patrol officers visited the house multiple times, but found no evidence that anyone was there. The lights were off, no cars were in the driveway, and all the doors and windows were closed. There were no signs of distress. It appeared as if the family had gone on vacation. Despite this, Susan's mother was deeply concerned that something might have gone wrong and urged the police to continue investigating. At 3:30 a.m. on September 28, 2008, a police officer in South Dakota spotted a suspicious vehicle parked near a closed gas station. He stopped to observe and noticed a teenager got out without turning on the headlights, did something briefly, then returned to the vehicle, and they all drove away. The officer decided to follow them. He saw that the car had Texas license plates, indicating they had traveled a long distance. However, it was unusual for teenagers to be out so late alone, making the situation seem very odd. The police officer pulled over the car and noticed a teenager driving. In the passenger seat was another minor, a girl, and in the back seat was a younger boy with a large dog. The car was stopped, and they were asked for identification, but none of them had any. The driver was 16-year-old Paul Henson. When the police officer checked his information, he discovered that Paul had been reported as a runaway and was also a suspect in a firearms case. The car belonged to Susan Bailey. Backup was requested, and they searched the stolen vehicle, but no gun was found. Jennifer's statements were inconsistent from the beginning. She appeared frightened and exhausted. Meanwhile, Texas police were alerted that the missing persons had been located. When Texas detectives heard this, they realized that Susan would never have allowed her children to travel that far without her. They suspected that something had happened to her and decided it was time to thoroughly investigate the Bailey home, especially after numerous requests from Susan's parents and colleagues. Upon entering the house, the detectives were immediately hit by a strong smell of decomposition. On the first floor, they found only a plate of pudding that had fallen on the floor. Forensic analysis later revealed that the pudding was laced with drugs. On the second floor, at the top of the stairs, they discovered Susan lying face down, blood everywhere. She had suffered 26 stab wounds and had been brutally beaten with a blunt object. The bathtub was filled with water, and an electric cord with exposed wires was hanging from the curtain plugged in. It appeared that someone had meticulously planned multiple methods to murder her. The smell of decomposition mixed with the smell of toiletries. A receipt found in the house confirmed that 13-year-old David had purchased these cleaning supplies at a local Walmart at the indicated time. In Jennifer's room, investigators found a diary in which she detailed plans for committing murder and starting a new life with Paul in Canada. They also uncovered additional evidence, including freshly cut hair belonging to Paul, clothing stained with Susan's blood, and DNA traces from Jennifer and David. It was clear that the teenagers had not effectively cleaned up the murder scene. The three suspects were detained in Texas, while a dog associated with them was taken to a shelter. The juvenile offenders quickly began to speak. Paul Henson accused David of the murder, claiming they all fled their town to protect the boy from the authorities. When detectives questioned David, he admitted to killing his mother and laughed. The detectives were taken aback. They did not expect such a response from a 13-year-old. Jennifer placed all the blame on Paul, insisting that she and her brother had done nothing wrong. The only person who avoided severe punishment was Marilee White, who was not in the car and had no evidence linking her to Susan's murder. However, she remained under police scrutiny for a long time and was questioned multiple times. Eventually, Marilee confirmed her friend's boyfriend's claims that they had planned to kill their families. She shared many details about their relationships. According to Marilee, Paul, Jennifer, and she had become very close. Paul enjoyed being intimate with both girls simultaneously, arguing that since he was dating Jennifer and had a separate relationship with Marilee, it wasn't cheating. The group engaged in occult practices, including cutting themselves and drinking each other's blood. Jennifer's plan was to kill all their parents, escape to Canada, and start their own commune. Because of her cooperation with the police, no charges were filed against Marilee. She was compelled to testify at the trial against the other conspirators. Based on her testimony, the prosecution believed that Jennifer ambushed her mother in a hallway on the second floor and attacked her with a bat, while Paul Henson came from behind and cut her throat. David also took part in the crime and inflicted superficial stab wounds on her body. Jennifer and Paul, despite being minors, were tried as adults for murder and each received a 60-year prison sentence. They will be eligible for parole starting in 2038. David was also tried as an adult for his involvement in the crime and was convicted of complicity, receiving a 26-year sentence. He will be eligible for release in 2034 when he turns 40. Following these events, Marilee White moved to a different state with her mother and changed her name. Her photo is kept confidential to protect her safety, as she was a young witness. Hello friends. Welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Marty Hill. Marty Hill, 42, lives in a cozy little town called Prairie Village, Kansas, USA. She is energetic, cheerful, and kind. From a young age, she was drawn to fine art, dreaming of becoming an artist or designer. To pursue this dream, she worked hard, completed her studies, and gained the necessary educational background. Eventually, she fulfilled her dream by working in the design studio of a clothing company. At the company, Marty is always highly regarded for his outstanding achievements and reliability. So, when she failed to show up for work on September 8, 2010, without any notice, everyone immediately suspected that something was wrong. No one knew what had happened, and she had not requested any leave. Initially, her colleagues hoped she might just be running late. They tried calling her but received no response and decided to wait a little longer. An important meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., and Marty's attendance was deemed essential. Her absence worried everyone since she was always responsible and fully aware of the meeting's importance. She is usually deeply involved with the group and consistently reports any issues, so her silence in this case is unusual. Growing increasingly uneasy, one of her friends tried calling her repeatedly, but the calls went unanswered. Overcome with fear, the friend began to break down in tears, sensing deep in her heart that something terrible might have happened to Marty. A friend decided to find out what had happened to Marty. One of her colleagues offered to visit her house and check on her. He arrived at her quiet residential neighborhood at 11:30 a.m. and knocked on her door, but there was no answer. This seemed odd, especially since her car was parked in the driveway, suggesting she should have been home. He walked around the house but saw nothing unusual, although he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The unsettling silence made him uneasy, so he returned to his car. The colleague returned to the office and discussed the situation with the others. They decided it was necessary to call the police to check on Marty. Because Marty had a 15-year-old daughter who was at school at the time, they agreed not to alarm her until they obtained more information about Marty's whereabouts. Eventually, the police were contacted, and the colleague stayed near Marty's driveway, waiting for the police to arrive. The police arrived at the scene within minutes. When the officer knocked on the door, there was no response, and there were no signs of forced entry. Looking through a window, he noticed a woman's purse sitting on the kitchen table, which indicated that Marty should have been inside. Concerned, the officer decided to check the door, suspecting she might be unwell and in need of help. To his surprise, the door was unlocked. The officer entered the house and searched the first and second floors but found nothing out of the ordinary. He then proceeded to check the basement. Using a flashlight, the officer realized there were no lights in the basement. As he descended to the very bottom, he spotted someone lying in a large pool of blood, curled up in a fetal position. The dim light revealed a gruesome scene. The room was splattered with so much blood that it resembled a torture chamber. At first, the police thought the victim was a man due to the large amount of blood, but upon closer inspection, they couldn't even determine the victim's gender. Based on the scene, they concluded that the person was dead. However, to their horror, the victim suddenly turned around and looked directly at them. The police discovered a severe wound on the victim's throat and observed that her face was so swollen, disfigured it resembled a gruesome, bloody mess. Believing the victim was on the verge of death, an officer leaned in and repeatedly asked, "Who did this?" Despite his efforts, the victim struggled to breathe and was unable to speak. Prior to questioning, the officer had already called for medical assistance. Though still alive, the victim was unable to reveal the identity of her attacker. The victim was rushed to the nearest hospital due to her critical condition, which made identifying her difficult. Her injuries were concentrated on her head and face, including multiple skull fractures, facial fractures, a concussion, and cerebral swelling. The wound was particularly devastating, slicing through muscles and vital blood vessels. Medical experts estimated her chances of survival at no more than 20%. Finally, the victim was identified to be Marty Hill, the owner of the home. Against all odds, the doctors managed to save her life. Attention immediately turned to her teenage daughter, Mackenzie, who was contacted right away. Mackenzie was in complete shock and had no idea what had transpired at their home. Upon hearing of the brutal attack, family members rushed to the hospital to be with Marty. The extent of her suffering was unimaginable, and her injuries were so severe that even her own mother didn't recognize her. Unfortunately, the doctors all gave the same grim prognosis regarding her chances of survival. Her condition was serious, but at least it was somewhat manageable. Family members took turns staying by her bedside every day. The situation was so overwhelming that they felt a mix of anger and helplessness. Her son, Stephen, felt the most anger. Living in Texas at the time, he returned home to be with his mother and offer his support. Stephen was the first person to enter the basement where his mother had been found. After the forensic investigator examined the house, they emerged from the basement and strictly prohibited anyone else from entering due to the gruesome nature of the scene. While the relatives grieved, Stephen cleaned up the blood himself. Detectives investigating the tragedy were baffled, unable to determine who could have committed such an act or why. Marty's family and friends were equally perplexed, as no one could imagine her having an enemy capable of such violence. Investigators searched for clues in her personal life, workplace, and relationships with her children but found nothing unusual. The crime was determined to be unrelated to abuse, as Marty's clothes remained intact, a conclusion later confirmed by the Armed Forces analysis. There was no indication of theft, nothing was missing, and the house showed no signs of forced entry. The circumstances of the crime were shrouded in mystery. Even Marty herself was unable to provide any information about the identity of her attacker. The police interviewed Marty's neighbors, but none of them were able to provide any significant information. The only clue reported was a sighting of a red, broken pickup truck near Marty's house at around 8 a.m., driven by a young, light-skinned, short man. This timing aligned with the approximate time of the attack determined by detectives. The officers followed up by visiting the sewing company where Marty worked to interview her colleagues, hoping to identify someone matching the description of the driver. However, this lead turned into another dead end, as none of her co-workers could offer useful information or suggest who might have been driving the pickup truck. Detectives then shifted their focus to Marty's family. They spoke with Marty's mother, Shirley Roth, who provided a potentially valuable lead. Shirley revealed that her daughter had not been romantically involved with anyone since divorcing her ex-husband 7 years earlier. Despite their divorce, they maintained regular contact because they shared custody of their daughter. Shirley explained that, following the divorce, Marty had dedicated herself entirely to her work and children and had shown no interest in dating. In Shirley's opinion, the only person who seemed like a potential suspect was Marty's ex-husband. This lead warranted further investigation, especially since Marty remained unconscious and unable to provide information herself. Detectives continued to speak with family members to identify Marty's ex-husband. Their children were quick to defend their father. Their daughter, Mackenzie, a high school student, took offense at the suggestion that her father could be a suspect. She asserted that her father could not have done such a thing, describing him as calm, non-confrontational, and someone who maintained a good relationship with his ex-wife and children. Their son, Stephen, also rejected the suspicion, stating that his father was incapable of committing the crime. Despite this, detectives could not dismiss the theory and decided to investigate it thoroughly. The police then visited Marty's ex-husband at his home. He was fully cooperative, invited them inside, and answered their questions openly. He appeared deeply affected by the incident, expressing that he still cared for Marty and was distressed by what had happened. He expressed relief that she had survived and shared that he was praying for her recovery. Although there was nothing initially suspicious, the police still needed to verify his alibi. He told them that, on the morning of the attack, he had taken his daughter to school before going to work. To confirm his statement, the police spoke with his daughter, Mackenzie, who was living with her grandmother, while they worked on verifying the details he had provided. A DNA sample was taken from him, though analysis would require time. For Mackenzie, the prohibition against seeing her father created additional hardship, making this a challenging period for everyone involved. The police also collected DNA samples from under Marty's nails, along with hair follicles found on her clothing. After comparing this evidence with the ex-husband's DNA, all suspicions about him were completely dismissed. His DNA did not match, and his alibi was verified. As a result, the ex-husband was officially cleared from the list of suspects, much to Mackenzie's relief. The family was finally able to reconnect and support one another as they waited for Marty to regain consciousness. Meanwhile, Marty's family tried to piece together what had happened and figure out who might have attacked her. Her mother, Shirley, recalled that not long before the incident, the grandmother's house had been broken into and robbed. This raised fears that the entire family could be targeted by a stalker intent on carrying out violent acts. However, the police had no definite answers, leaving the family engulfed in fear and paranoia. They had no clue who the perpetrator could be and clung to hope that Marty would recover and reveal what had truly happened. The family also recalled that, shortly before the attack, a handyman had visited Marty's house to change the locks. This handyman worked for B&J Construction, a company her mother and grandmother had trusted and hired for years. Coincidentally, he was the only unfamiliar person who had interacted with Marty in recent months. This raised suspicions that the handyman, who often did repair work for the family, might be connected to both the robbery and the assault. The police turned their attention to Brian Pennington, the handyman who had regularly visited Marty's house, her mother's house, and her grandmother's house to handle household repairs and maintenance. At the time, Brian was 26 years old, married, and the father of 2 children. He lived about an hour and a half away in a small town called Leeton, Missouri, with a population of around 500. On September 10, 2010, detectives decided to visit Brian's home. When they arrived, they immediately noticed a broken red pickup truck in the driveway, which matched a description provided by neighbors of a suspicious vehicle. However, the truck did not have license plates, so they were unable to confirm the match. Inside the house, they found Brian, who was cooperative and permitted the officers to enter his kitchen. He answered their questions openly. When asked about the truck, Brian explained that he didn't drive it because it had no license plates. He also mentioned that his last visit to Marty's house had been 3 to 4 days before the attack, during which he had checked the basement equipment. Brian didn't contact the police after seeing on the news that Marty had been attacked. He explained that he didn't know anything and couldn't provide any useful information about the case. Brian wasn't very familiar with Marty. Their interactions had been limited to working together on repairing her house. Although he considered her a respectable woman, that was all he could share with the authorities. However, detectives began to question his account. Their suspicions were triggered by the fresh scratches on his face, which might have been caused during a confrontation with Marty. When asked about these marks, he explained that they were caused by a dog that had scratched him while he was playing in the yard the day before the detectives came to visit. He acted fearful when accused of being involved in the crime, insisting that he was incapable of such an act. Brian provided an alibi, prompting investigators to verify his story. When detectives spoke to Brian's wife, Jessica, they noticed her odd behavior from the outset. She appeared hesitant, seemed afraid to disclose the truth, dodged direct questions, and mentioned there had been tension in their relationship lately. Jessica stated that her husband had been at home that morning, sleeping in another room, and added that the last time he had worked at Marty's house was about a month earlier. She also corroborated Brian's claim that the scratches on his face were caused by a dog. However, her demeanor suggested she was not being truthful. Detectives doubted her account, and she was taken to the station for further questioning. Authorities suspected Jessica might either be an accomplice to the crime or trying to shield the killer. Before leaving Brian's house, the police asked him whether they would find anything suspicious if they searched the property. Brian confidently stated that they wouldn't find anything and even agreed to let them look around. However, in the laundry basket, at the very bottom, they discovered a pair of jeans with suspicious stains. Brian explained that the stains weren't blood but merely machine oil left over from working on a pickup truck. He allowed the police to take the jeans for testing and voluntarily provided his DNA samples for comparison. The items were immediately sent to the forensic lab, where tests confirmed the stains were blood, not oil. However, additional time was needed to extract the DNA profile and compare it. While detectives awaited the test results, Marty regained consciousness in the hospital 12 days after the attack. Although she was able to communicate shortly thereafter, her initial days out of unconsciousness were clouded by confusion. During this time, she experienced constant pain and discomfort. It's not surprising that Marty needed to take a large number of medications during her recovery. Her poor health may have stemmed from her reliance on these drugs, in addition to the severe injuries she suffered. Despite the extensive brain damage she endured, her memory remained largely intact. Marty informed the police that Brian Pennington was the one who had attacked her. She described that morning's incident as starting entirely normally. She woke up early, got ready for work, and followed her usual routine. Around 7:30 a.m., she heard a car stop in front of her house but didn't pay it much attention. Soon after, there was a knock at the door. It was Brian, who had worked on her house about a month earlier. Marty found his visit odd from the beginning. It was unplanned and too early in the morning. However, she reassured herself, thinking he might have been working nearby or had forgotten a tool during his last visit. Although she was hesitant to open the door, she ultimately decided to do so. The two had a brief conversation. Brian was polite and friendly, which helped ease her concerns. Brian explained that he had heard Marty was planning to sell her house and wanted to alert her to a problem he had noticed during the previous renovation. He insisted it was important and offered to show her the issue in the basement. Curiosity overcame her, and she agreed to follow him downstairs. She recounted that everything happened very quickly. Initially, they were just walking downstairs, but an unsettling feeling suddenly came over her. Brian grabbed her and pushed her down the stairs, causing her head to hit hard against the concrete floor. Brian violently attacked Marty, choking her until she lost consciousness. Later, Marty explained that her memories of the incident were hazy, as though she were trapped in a fog. She occasionally regained consciousness, only to lose it again shortly afterward. Eventually, a policeman arrived at her home, and she was taken to the hospital. Investigators needed evidence to support Marty's account. Tests were conducted on a pair of jeans found in Brian's laundry basket, which revealed traces of Marty's blood. DNA samples taken from beneath her fingernails also matched his DNA. Law enforcement officers obtained an arrest warrant for Brian and visited his home, but he was not there. The search for him intensified, and soon police in the city discovered a damaged red pickup truck. Jessica was behind the wheel, and Brian was sitting in the passenger seat, visibly disheveled. Authorities charged Brian with attempted murder and robbery, setting bail at $1 million. The news stunned Marty's mother and grandmother, who had been in contact with Brian for years and trusted him as a professional handyman. Brian frequently worked for Marty's family, completing various household repairs. Tragically, it was Marty's mother who had recommended him to her daughter, leaving her with a deep sense of guilt. The family struggled to comprehend this senseless act of aggression. Brian's cruelty seemed inexplicable, and no clear motive emerged. Although he provided no explanation for his actions, experts were left baffled by the sheer brutality of the attack. Doctors were amazed that Marty had survived at all. Brian's violence extended far beyond simply choking Marty into unconsciousness. He threw her down a staircase, causing her to land headfirst on a concrete floor, fracturing her skull. He continued his attack relentlessly, beating her and slashing her throat. Marty struggled to comprehend what she could have done to warrant such a terrible fate. After sustaining severe head injuries, she faced challenges with her balance, although she eventually managed to walk independently. Shortly after emerging from a coma, she developed visual impairments, along with hearing and cognitive difficulties. Her family noticed that Marty seemed like a shadow of her former self, but they remained hopeful for her recovery. At times, she would lapse into long periods of thoughtfulness, which deeply concerned her loved ones, especially her daughter. Doctors refrained from making a definitive prognosis. While acknowledging the challenges Marty faced, they emphasized that her survival against the odds suggested that recovery was possible. After spending about a month in the hospital, Marty was finally discharged. During her recovery period, she became closer to her 16-year-old daughter, Mackenzie, whose birthday occurred while she was still in the hospital. Mackenzie was deeply touched by a card her mother wrote for her, even though the handwriting resembled that of a child. She recognized the long journey ahead and understood her vital role in supporting her mother as she gradually healed. Marty faced significant emotional challenges after the attack, struggling to reconcile how someone she had trusted deeply could turn out to be a vicious criminal capable of unprovoked violence. Seeking solace, she turned to her local church for emotional support. Meanwhile, Marty's family was determined to ensure that Brian faced justice and received a lengthy prison sentence. The prosecutor's office had overwhelming evidence to press charges against him, including physical proof, Marty's detailed account of the attack, scratches on Brian's face, DNA matches, and items stained with blood. The only missing piece was a clear motive. Brian had neither attempted to abuse Marty nor stolen anything from her home. His actions were simply a deliberate and calculated effort to kill her while working in her house. This act of violence was sudden and seemed to lack any apparent provocation. Marty had no prior conflicts with Brian, and relations between him and other women in her family had been peaceful. However, as police investigated Brian's background, they uncovered a troubling history of criminal activity. He had been convicted in 26 separate cases, most of which were related to domestic violence. His ex-wife and former girlfriends had reported him to the police numerous times. Jessica admitted that she had shielded him out of fear of becoming his next target, as his behavior was systematically abusive. Brian frequently threatened her, exhibiting a clear pattern of cruelty. Jessica testified for the prosecution during the trial, stating that Brian was not home on the night of the attack. She explained that he had been away for hours and only returned around noon, after Marty was assaulted. Upon his return, his clothes were covered in blood. When questioned, he claimed it was machine oil but offered no further explanation. Jessica also refuted his claim that the scratches were allegedly caused by the dog, revealing that he had forced her to lie under the threat of being killed. She provided detailed accounts of their married life, describing him as abusive, both physically and emotionally. During the trial, Brian was visibly shocked when Marty appeared alive in court to testify against him. Jessica, his wife, also testified for the prosecution, presenting evidence that contradicted his statements. Moreover, none of Brian's claims were corroborated during the hearings. Jessica submitted cell phone records showing that, at approximately 8 a.m. on the morning of the attack, she had tried to contact Brian. Geolocation data confirmed that he was near Marty's house at the time. As the evidence against Brian continues to build, he has no viable path to acquittal. To avoid a prolonged and traumatic trial, Brian was offered a plea bargain. Although he could have faced up to 40 years in prison, the deal reduced his sentence to 28 years. However, on the day his sentence was to be announced, Brian unexpectedly attempted to withdraw the plea agreement and plead guilty instead. The court rejected his request, citing no valid justification for accepting it. During the final courtroom proceedings, Marty directly asked Brian why he had attacked her and nearly killed her, but he refused to provide a reason or make any closing statements. Marty is still recovering from the devastating attack, which left permanent scars on her face and neck. The injuries have distorted her facial features and affected her mobility. Despite these challenges, Marty remains determined and continues to train rigorously, believing she can regain her former self or even surpass it. In interviews, she often reflects on how someone only 26 years old could commit such a cruel act. Her resilience and self-belief have helped her heal from this violent incident, strengthening her resolve in the process. Marty returned to her routine fairly quickly and has become even more active. She took up kickboxing to learn self-defense, and sports have played a significant role in her recovery. She also created a website aimed at supporting others who have experienced traumatic events, using her personal story to inspire and encourage healing. In addition to these efforts, Marty continues to work as a designer for a clothing company, channeling her creativity into her art as a way to manage anxiety and stress. She credits her daughter, Mackenzie, as the cornerstone of her recovery and is deeply grateful for her unwavering support. Recently, Marty published a book that details the horrific incident that changed her life, with the hope of inspiring others to overcome adversity through resilience. She now actively works as a motivational speaker, meeting with various communities and offering the same support that helped her rebuild her life. As for Brian Pennington, her attacker, he remains in prison and is estranged from his family, including his mother, ex-wife, and children, who have all cut ties with him. When a young woman suddenly stopped answering her phone and disappeared without a trace, her family immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Police got involved, confident they'd solve the case quickly. After all, she'd been house-sitting in a quiet Michigan neighborhood where nothing unusual ever happened. But what unfolded felt less like a typical missing person case and more like the start of a dark crime story. A car found deep in the woods, a body discovered in a basement, a confession that didn't make sense, and evidence pointing everywhere except where detectives claimed it did. What no one realized then was that this was only the beginning. When the truth finally came out, more than 10 years later, it didn't just devastate her family. It exposed major failures within the justice system and left people across the country in disbelief. To understand how everything went so wrong, we have to return to where it all started, with a young woman named Andrea Eilber. Andrea Eilber was born on April 17, 1991, in Flint, Michigan. Her mother passed away when she was a child, and her father later remarried. The family eventually settled in the small town of Otisville, where Andrea completed high school. After graduating, she took a job at a nearby supermarket. She thought about going to college but was still unsure of a specific direction, so she continued working and saving for the future. At work, she met Kenneth Carl Grondin, a 19-year-old co-worker. The two soon began dating. In November 2011, when Andrea was 20, her aunt and uncle left town and asked her to help house sit. At that time, she was still living with her parents, but decided to temporarily move to her aunt and uncle's house to help look after their home. For the first few days, Kenneth and a friend visited her there. They hung out, watched movies, and enjoyed each other's company. Andrea and Kenneth later made plans to spend the evening of November 14 together. She was supposed to pick him up, but shortly before then, she texted to say she couldn't make it. Instead, she asked him to go to her aunt and uncle's house, bringing some movie DVDs. Kenneth arrived around 7:30 p.m., but the house was dark, locked, and Andrea's car was gone. After knocking with no response, he tried calling her, but she didn't answer. Assuming she had stepped out, he decided to wait. About half an hour later, Andrea texted him again, saying her plans had changed and they would see each other the next day. She didn't explain where she was, and she didn't respond to any more of Kenneth's messages. The next day passed with no word from Andrea. At first, only Kenneth was worried. Since Andrea was staying at her aunt and uncle's house, her father wasn't concerned when he didn't hear from her right away. But after another day without contact, he began to worry. He asked a relative to check on her, and she went to the house with Kenneth. They looked through the windows and walked around but found no one there. Andrea's father started calling her friends, and none had heard from her for over 24 hours. The family began to fear something was wrong and organized a search. Family and friends split into groups, driving through nearby towns, parks, and other places Andrea might have gone. That evening, one of her friends found her car parked in a remote area near a national park. Just a few miles from her relative's home. The car doors were unlocked. The keys were missing, and Andrea was not there. Her father immediately called the police. With Andrea's uncle's consent, the police broke into the house. In the basement, they made a terrible discovery. Andrea was sitting in a chair with a gunshot wound to her head. The medical examiner determined she had been killed by a single gunshot fired from several feet away. She had died 2 days earlier. On the same night, she canceled her plans with Kenneth. The coroner also found marks on Andrea's wrists, indicating she had been bound with plastic tape, although the tape was missing when the body was found. The analysis suggested the ties had been removed 6 or 7 hours after her death, raising the possibility that the killer either returned later or stayed in the house for hours afterward. Investigators noted that some items were missing from the home, but it didn't appear to be a typical burglary. Most valuables were left untouched. The missing items included a bottle of perfume, a sweater, a camera, 3 knives, a rifle, ammunition, and some cash. Jewelry, and even a piece of solid gold in plain sight, were left behind. While crime scene technicians searched the house, detectives learned that Andrea had a boyfriend named Kenneth and went to question him. Kenneth explained when he'd last seen Andrea and willingly gave DNA and fingerprint samples. The police confiscated the clothes he wore that night and searched his home, but found nothing suspicious. Despite this, detectives continued to question Kenneth, and over time they began to suspect that he might be the killer. Kenneth denied the accusation and took a polygraph test, which indicated no signs of deception. He said that on the night of November 14th, Andrea had suddenly canceled their plans, and he had been heartbroken. He assumed she was planning to break up with him. Upset, he went home, charged his phone, and texted a female friend, telling her that he thought Andrea was about to leave him. They messaged for a while, and then Kenneth drove to the store where she worked. The two talked more about the situation, and eventually, she invited him to join her and her roommate for a movie night. Kenneth arrived at their place around 10:00 p.m., which both women later confirmed. His phone data supported his story, showing his phone connected to a nearby cell tower at that time. About 20 minutes before arriving, a gas station camera caught him on camera. That same night, someone withdrew $300 from Andrea's bank account in the town of Davidson, about a 30-minute drive from her uncle's house. What's noteworthy is that this transaction took place only 7 minutes after Kenneth arrived at his friend's house. Far too short a time for him to have traveled between the two places. Nevertheless, the police have not yet removed him from the list of suspects. Kenneth stayed with his friends until around midnight and then went home. The next morning, he tried calling Andrea several times, but she didn't answer. Worried, he drove to her uncle's house around 10:00 a.m. and knocked on the door, but no one answered. He left and was back home by about 11:00 a.m., something confirmed by his family and his phone's data. Around that same time, another $300 was withdrawn from Andrea's account, this time in a different, more distant town. Police obtained surveillance footage of the person using the card. The image was too blurry to identify the suspect, but it showed a white pickup truck at the scene. Despite the evidence suggesting Kenneth's innocence, detectives still had doubts. They thought parts of his story didn't make sense. Kenneth admitted that he drove to Andrea's uncle's house around the time of her death and sat in the car outside for about 30 minutes, which struck detectives as odd. On top of that, when Andrea's friends and family organized a search for her on the evening of November 15th, Kenneth said he couldn't join because he had to work early the next day. Later, he told detectives he had already spent the day looking for Andrea and calling her repeatedly, assuming she was ignoring him. He believed she wanted to end the relationship, not that something bad had happened. Another concern arose when a friend of Kenneth's, who was helping with the search, asked for Andrea's uncle's home address. Kenneth gave him the wrong location, about 3 miles from the actual house. Investigators thought this was strange because Kenneth had been there many times before. Although there was still no solid evidence against him, detectives kept pressing. After more than 10 hours of questioning, police claimed Kenneth had confessed. In his affidavit, Kenneth said he went to Andrea's uncle's house that night, entered, and discovered her body in the basement. He said he thought she had hurt herself and decided to stage the crime to look like a murder so her family wouldn't know. He admitted to taking a few items that were nearby but didn't provide many details beyond that. Kenneth's confession was short, unclear, and filled with vague wording. He insisted he hadn't killed Andrea. He only claimed to have found her body. Still, detectives believed they finally had enough evidence and arrested him. As soon as they charged him with murder, Kenneth tried to take back his statement. He explained that detectives had interrogated him for hours, bombarding him with accusations until he was completely worn down. Eventually, they told him that if he wrote down a version of events where he simply discovered Andrea's body, he could go home. Believing them, Kenneth complied. But that statement became the centerpiece of the case against him. Kenneth also said detectives repeatedly deceived him. They claimed to have solid forensic evidence linking him to the crime and told him he had failed the polygraph test miserably. It was later revealed that his grandfather had hired a lawyer and sent a lawyer to the station to help. When the lawyer tried to locate Kenneth, one detective hung up on him and warned others not to disclose Kenneth's whereabouts. The lawyer spent the entire day making calls, but no officer would provide information. Kenneth, unaware that his lawyer was trying to contact him, continued to speak privately with the detectives. He later said his confession was nothing more than him repeating what they told him to say, hoping to finally go home. In truth, Kenneth claimed he didn't even know Andrea was dead. Less than a day after Andrea's body was found, detectives announced they had found a suspect. Kenneth's family and friends refused to believe he was involved, but there was little they could do. Police ended their investigation, convinced his confession would be enough to convict him. Forensic evidence, however, told a different story. Experts tested multiple samples from the crime scene, including skin under Andrea's fingernails. The DNA belonged to an unknown man, not Kenneth. A second sample found in Andrea's car matched the same unidentified person. Then there was Andrea's bank card. Someone had been withdrawing her money, but it wasn't Kenneth. Despite these red flags, detectives claimed to have found new evidence. When one officer opened the sealed bag containing Kenneth's clothes from the night Andrea disappeared, he noticed a single bloody hair stuck to Kenneth's pants. Tests showed that the hair and blood were both Andrea's, but strangely, the pants were completely bloodless. Forensic experts concluded that the hair could have been attached after Andrea died, because if Kenneth had really killed someone while wearing those pants, there would have been blood splatter. Kenneth's lawyer argued that the hair could have been contaminated during the process of collecting evidence. Kenneth's clothes were confiscated only 30 minutes after the body was found, so it is highly likely that the police accidentally got the hair on them while processing the scene. The lawyer also asked the court to dismiss Kenneth's confession, arguing that police had blocked him from seeing his client during questioning. In addition, parts of the interrogation video had mysteriously disappeared. Precisely the moments when, according to Kenneth, detectives were feeding him the answers. The legal battle lasted 4 years before the court finally ruled that the confession would remain admissible. During that time, Kenneth was out on bail but strictly monitored. He wore a GPS ankle tracker and needed police approval to leave his home. When the trial began in 2015, the prosecution relied mainly on 2 pieces of evidence: Kenneth's confession and the bloody hair found on his pants. Their theory was that he had killed Andrea during a robbery. Even though none of the stolen items were found in his possession and her bank card had clearly been used by someone else, the prosecutor tried to explain the inconsistencies by claiming the robbery was staged. He argued that Kenneth killed Andrea to steal her money and property, but also claimed that he had staged the crime scene to create a distraction. This reasoning was weak, especially since Kenneth came from a wealthy family and didn't need the money. The prosecutor also stressed that there was no sign of forced entry and that Kenneth had a spare key to Andrea's uncle's house. Andrea had given it to him just a few days before she died, so he could visit any time. Kenneth, however, insisted he had left the key inside the house 2 days before her death. A friend who was with him at the time confirmed this account, and police later found the spare key exactly where Kenneth had said it would be. The defense argued that the case was filled with inconsistencies and that the investigation was poorly handled. They pointed out a detail the police seemed to overlook. Andrea's car had been taken and later abandoned a few miles from her house. Her father testified that the car constantly leaked oil under the driver's seat, which always left Andrea's shoes stained. By that logic, anyone who drove her car would have oil on their shoes as well. But when investigators examined Kenneth's boots, there wasn't any trace of oil. The prosecutor then changed the theory, suggesting Kenneth had an accomplice. In this version, Kenneth killed Andrea while the accomplice took the stolen items, drove off in her car, and used her bank card. Another major issue for the prosecution was that the murder weapon was never found. Police confirmed that the missing rifle from Andrea's uncle's house and Kenneth's parents' gun did not match the bullet that killed her. Kenneth's lawyer argued that the police had ignored other possible suspects because they were fixated on Kenneth from the start. To support this, the defense presented 5 alternative suspects. At the top of the list was Jeffrey, a mutual acquaintance of Kenneth and Andrea. There were several suspicious details about him. He was the one who conveniently found Andrea's car early in the search, even though it was parked miles away in a secluded area. That same day, he called Kenneth asking about Andrea, even though Kenneth had never given him his phone number. Investigators later learned Andrea had written Kenneth's number on a piece of paper that was found on her nightstand next to a spot where unidentified DNA was recovered. Jeffrey also owned a car that looked very similar to the one caught on surveillance footage when someone used Andrea's bank card at a gas station. Andrea's brother mentioned another possible suspect, a banned substance dealer. He admitted that he had been struggling with addiction and owed the dealer money. According to her brother, the dealer knew Andrea saved money from her job. So, her brother suspects the dealer may have killed her to collect the debt. Police also investigated a young man named David after his father reported that he might have been involved in Andrea's murder. David had a criminal record for car theft and assault and resembled the person seen on the surveillance video using Andrea's bank card. Despite all these leads, detectives said they found no solid evidence connecting any of these suspects to the crime. When the trial ended, the jury deliberated for 2 days before finding Kenneth guilty of first-degree murder. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His attorney immediately filed an appeal. The defense first argued that Kenneth's confession was coerced and that police had denied him legal counsel. But the court rejected those claims. Next, they appealed the robbery conviction, pointing out that Kenneth had also been found guilty of theft even though none of the stolen items were ever recovered. That appeal also failed. However, in their third attempt, Kenneth's lawyer found a significant error in the jury paperwork. Jurors had been given 2 separate murder charges to consider, first-degree and second-degree. For the first-degree charge, they could choose between guilty or not guilty. But for second-degree murder, the only option listed was guilty. This meant the jury had no way to find Kenneth not guilty of the lesser charge. They were forced to decide only how guilty he was. The appeals court could not overlook such a major procedural flaw. In 2018, Kenneth was granted a new trial after spending 3 years in prison. Following the ruling, he was released on bail again. His lawyer continued to push for new evidence that could identify the real killer, repeatedly urging police to re-examine the existing DNA samples. In 2022, investigators finally agreed to conduct a new review. At that point, Kenneth's retrial had still not started, and he remained free on bail. Forensic experts reanalyzed all unidentified male DNA connected to the case, but there were still no matches in the FBI database. They then decided to focus on the strongest piece of evidence, a cigarette butt found outside Andrea's uncle's house. This sample matched the same man whose DNA had been found under Andrea's fingernails. Confirming he was the true killer, investigators sent the cigarette butt to Arthrom, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. In January 2023, experts made a breakthrough. By using public genetic databases and tracing family connections, they identified a possible suspect, a 42-year-old man named Chadwick Mobley, who had not appeared in the original investigation. Detectives discovered that Chadwick lived in a town about 40 minutes away from the crime scene when Andrea was murdered. His phone records from November 2011 showed that on the day Andrea was killed, his phone connected to a tower near her aunt and uncle's home 23 times. By 2023, Chadwick was living in Utah, working as a delivery driver and living out of his van. Investigators asked local police to secretly collect an item containing his DNA. But because he often stayed in open areas, surveillance proved difficult. After 2 months of monitoring, officers still hadn't retrieved anything usable, so detectives decided to confront him directly. With a warrant in hand, they approached Chadwick and collected a DNA sample. He denied any involvement, but lab tests soon confirmed his DNA was under Andrea's fingernails, inside her car, and in multiple locations at the crime scene. When police searched his van, they also found a revolver. Ballistic analysis proved it was the weapon used to kill Andrea. 2 days later, police went to follow up, but Chadwick had fled. 3 weeks later, authorities tracked him to Montana near the Canadian border, where he was caught, but while being extradited to Michigan, he escaped from a police car. Despite being handcuffed and shackled, a few days later, a local sheriff spotted him by chance, paddling down a river in a canoe. That led to his second capture. This time, he was successfully brought back to Michigan and placed in custody without bail. As he had already escaped twice, Chadwick pleaded not guilty, and prosecutors began preparing their case. For local law enforcement, it was a humiliating turn of events. After more than a decade of insisting Kenneth was the killer, the new evidence, including DNA under Andrea's fingernails and the murder weapon, now pointed unmistakably to Chadwick. Investigators looked into whether Kenneth and Chadwick had any connection. Maybe they'd worked together or crossed paths? But they found none. The two men were complete strangers, and Andrea didn't know Chadwick either. At the time of her murder, Chadwick was 32 and living in a nearby town with no link to her. Despite all the new evidence, Kenneth's conviction remained in place. He continued to live under strict monitoring, wearing an ankle bracelet. Prosecutors even intensified their efforts, announcing their intention to hold a second trial based on the theory that Kenneth and Chadwick had committed the murder together. That second trial never happened for Chadwick. In February 2025, he entered a no-contest plea, meaning he wouldn't fight the charges but also wouldn't admit guilt. He told the judge he'd been extremely drunk the night Andrea was killed and couldn't remember what had happened. Though he didn't deny being involved, during the hearing, an alarming detail surfaced. Investigators had actually considered Chadwick a suspect early in the case. However, for reasons no one could explain, his name was never officially added to the case file. By then, detectives had already focused on Kenneth. Ignoring the DNA mismatch and the missing murder weapon, Chadwick Mobley was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without parole. In court, he apologized to Andrea's family. For Kenneth, though, nothing changed. His lawyer immediately requested that the charges be dropped, but prosecutors refused, claiming that Chadwick's conviction didn't rule out Kenneth's involvement. They vowed to proceed with a second trial. Chadwick insisted he didn't know Kenneth or Andrea and had acted alone. Nevertheless, the state continued to pursue the case. The new trial for Kenneth is scheduled for January 2026. He remains under house arrest as his defense team builds his case, supported by a respected forensic expert who re-examined the bloodied hair on Kenneth's pants. The expert confirmed earlier findings, that the hair must have ended up there several hours after Andrea's death, not during the murder. Considering all the evidence, the DNA results, the recovered weapon, Chadwick's conviction, and the forensic analysis, Kenneth now has a strong chance of clearing his name. But the toll has been immense. 14 years of his life are gone. Years spent behind bars and confined to his home. Even if the courts finally recognize his innocence, he'll never recover that lost time. And if he decides to seek justice against the officers and prosecutors responsible, that battle could last many more years. With no certainty he'll ever be fully vindicated. In every peaceful town, behind every perfect family portrait, there can be a story no one dares to imagine. It was one of those quiet Italian communities where the days felt predictable, the streets felt safe, and the Del Grande family appeared to be everything a household should be. Hardworking, respected, united. But behind the walls of their elegant home, something far more sinister had been growing for years. An emotional storm centered around one troubled son. And on a cold January night in 1998, that storm finally erupted, leaving a trail of devastation that shook Italy to its core. This is the story of Elia Del Grande, the man who would turn his family home into a massacre scene. Elia Del Grande was raised in a hard-working family. His father, Ennio Del Grande, had always been ambitious, studious, determined, and committed to building something of his own. Through years of dedication, he managed to open and grow a family bakery business that became well known in the area. Shortly after completing his studies, Ennio met Alida, a driven young woman, 5 years his junior. They quickly began a relationship, married soon after, and welcomed their first son, Enrico. 5 years later, their second child, Elia, was born. They did not plan to have more children. They wanted to focus on expanding their business and raising their 2 sons, future heirs to the family enterprise. Enrico grew up intelligent, quiet, and diligent. Elia, on the other hand, was his complete opposite. From early childhood, Elia was energetic, impulsive, and increasingly difficult to control. Even Ennio struggled with his temper. When Elia began attending school, his behavior only worsened. He frequently clashed with classmates, leading the family to consider placing him in a special program for troubled youth. In the end, they decided instead to have him live temporarily with his grandmother and aunt. For 3 years, Elia stayed with his relatives. When he returned home, his parents hoped that the change of environment had made a difference. At first, he seemed calmer, but soon the disruptive behavior resumed. When Elia graduated from school, the family hoped maturity would help him settle down. His parents did everything they could to support him, but their efforts failed. Elia had fallen into alcohol and banned substances use as a teenager, and after graduation, his addictions deepened. The Del Grande family lived together in a large home in Cadrazate, a peaceful town in northern Italy. Locals respected Ennio, Alida, and Enrico for their kindness and work ethic. Elia, however, became famous for all the wrong reasons. By the mid-1992s, his behavior became increasingly dangerous. The turning point came when Elia attacked a taxi driver with a knife, inflicting serious injuries that cost the man an eye. Even then, his parents continued to support him. Yet they also recognized that drastic measures were needed. Because the family owned a property in Santo Domingo, the capital of the Dominican Republic, they decided to send Elia there in hopes that distance and structure would help him turn his life around. At first, the plan seemed promising. Elia found work at a family-run club in Santo Domingo, part of their broader business interests. But soon Enea and Alida learned that he had begun a relationship with a local woman, someone they believed had the same emotional instability and personal struggles as their son. The entire family opposed the relationship, fearing it would push him further off track. But Elia was stubborn. He insisted on marrying the woman, defying all objections. Every argument with his family ended with him threatening to run away permanently to start a new life with her. Tensions between Elia and his parents grew worse. Their disagreements became constant, and the household atmosphere deteriorated rapidly. Then came January 7, 1998. Its emergency operators received a chilling call that evening. A young man, barely able to speak and gasping for air, reported that someone had broken into the Del Grande home and shot the entire family. Before he could identify himself, the call abruptly ended. The dispatcher, alarmed and confused, immediately alerted the nearest patrol officer several kilometers from the villa. The Del Grande family was well known in the community. He was shocked that a shooting could have occurred in such a quiet, safe neighborhood. But instead of making quick assumptions, he approached cautiously, determined to understand what had really happened. When he reached the villa, everything looked eerily still. The house was dark, silent, no movement visible through the windows. Shortly after the patrol officer arrived, an ambulance pulled up to the address. The officer knocked repeatedly and rang the doorbell, but no one responded. He tried calling back the young man who had placed the emergency call, but the first attempt went unanswered. He dialed several more times. On the final call, someone picked up, yet no words followed. All he could hear was strained, panicked breathing. As if the caller was unable to speak, the situation clearly appeared dire. The officer decided he could not wait any longer. He forced open the door and stepped inside the house. Unsure whether the shooter was still present, he called for backup and moved cautiously forward with his weapon drawn. A quick sweep of the ground floor revealed nothing, so he proceeded upstairs. There, lying in a pool of blood near a telephone, he found a young man, 27-year-old Enrico Del Grande. Though gravely wounded, he was still alive. Emergency responders provided first aid and rushed him to the hospital. But he died shortly afterward. As the officer continued examining the home, he noticed heavy bloodstains across the living room and hallway. Following the trail, he reached the master bedroom. Beside the bed lay 53-year-old Alida Del Grande, already deceased from a gunshot wound. The room bore clear signs of a struggle. Items scattered across the floor and overturned objects indicated she had fought desperately for her life. But to no avail. The search continued through the villa until the officer reached the garage. There, next to the family car, he found the body of 58-year-old Enea Del Grande, the patriarch of the family. He had been shot multiple times in the back and head. He had died before help arrived. One person, however, was missing: the youngest son, Elia. Investigators searched the property, but he was nowhere to be found. Inside the house, they quickly noticed that one firearm from Enea's hunting rifle collection was missing. The caliber matched the bullets used in the killings. Shell casings were scattered near the victims, and an empty ammunition box was discovered in a closet. Yet far more rounds were missing than had been fired. Whoever committed the murders had fled heavily armed. Local residents were warned immediately. At first, authorities feared that the killer might have taken Elia hostage. Early speculation suggested a burglary gone wrong, but that theory quickly collapsed. Aside from the missing rifle, nothing valuable had been taken. Jewelry, electronics, cash, all untouched. There were no signs of forced entry on any door or window. These facts pointed to one conclusion: this was not a robbery. It was personal. And driven by hatred, the search for 22-year-old Elia Del Grande escalated rapidly. Within hours, the scenario shifted from a potential kidnapping to a manhunt for the primary and only suspect. Carabinieri investigators began gathering background information on the family. and the picture that emerged was troubling. These suspicions were reinforced when investigators confirmed Elia had a previous criminal record for a particularly brutal incident involving a taxi driver. When police interviewed the man who survived that attack, he recounted the event with visible emotion. It occurred shortly after Elia turned 17. The man, a local driver well known to the Del Grande family, had often driven Elia home after nights out. On that night, Elia had been agitated from the moment he got into the car. The driver, familiar with Elia's volatile temper, tried not to provoke him and remained silent. It made no difference. Without warning or apparent reason, Elia suddenly lunged at him, stabbing him repeatedly and inflicting injuries so severe that the driver lost an eye. The incident deeply alarmed investigators and raised serious concerns about Elia's mental stability. While searching his room, police uncovered a large collection of bladed weapons. Those who knew him described this fascination as an obsession. He owned nearly 100 knives of various shapes, sizes. Former classmates and teachers recalled him as impulsive, easily provoked, frequently involved in conflicts both inside and outside of school. He also gravitated toward extremist circles and was known to have associated with a group of local skinheads. Investigators soon discovered that the Del Grande family had tried everything to help him, yet nothing seemed to make a lasting difference. In an effort to pull their son out of his downward spiral, his parents eventually made a drastic decision. They sent Elia to Santo Domingo. The family owned several properties there, including a nightclub that was popular with locals. They believed that distancing him from the troubled friendships he had formed in Italy would give him a fresh start. At first, the change of scenery seemed promising. Elia found work at the family's nightclub, and for a brief period his parents hoped he might eventually take a stable role in the business. But those hopes quickly faded. The nightclub scene was no less problematic than the environment he had left behind. It attracted all kinds of questionable characters, and hard-banned substances were readily available. It was there. Investigators believe that Elia, who had previously used only softer substances, began experimenting with much more dangerous ones. Even worse, he soon became involved with a young Dominican woman who works as an escort, servicing truck drivers. Instead of keeping his distance, Elia became infatuated with her and immersed himself in a chaotic lifestyle. Elia began financially supporting the woman, hoping she might leave escort. He paid for everything: her food, rent, clothing, and mounting personal debts. Month after month, he poured more money into the relationship for Elia. His obsession with the young woman soon became as consuming as his fascination with weapons. Initially, he tried to hide the relationship from his family, but they quickly noticed that Elia's spending had spiraled out of control. He was wasting large sums not only on the woman but also on prohibited substances and other illegal activities. Concerned, his older brother Enrico traveled to Santo Domingo to confront him. When Enrico discovered the full extent of the situation, he immediately informed their parents. They insisted Elia return to Italy. But by then he refused to leave the Dominican Republic. Tensions within the family escalated. After Enrico's failed attempt to bring Elia home, Elia wrote an angry letter in which he openly expressed contempt for his parents and hinted that things would end badly if they continued interfering in his life. Still, the Del Grande family was determined. Shortly before Christmas 1997, they finally convinced Elia to return to Italy. But once he arrived back home, arguments resumed almost immediately, always revolving around the same topic: the woman from Santo Domingo. No one in the family wanted her entering their lives or their home. The hostility continued to grow, and Elia's resentment intensified. According to the reconstructed timeline, on the evening of January 6, 1998, Elia and his parents went to a local pizzeria for dinner. There, he once again brought up his desire to return to the Dominican Republic to marry the woman. He insisted he planned to wed her on January 10. To his parents, this sounded reckless and dangerous. Exhausted by his behavior, they struggled to stay calm. They had no intention of allowing their son to marry an escort. A heated argument erupted once more. Elia left abruptly and did not return home with his parents. Instead, he went to visit a friend, 33-year-old Pier Angelo, a stable hand from Vergiate and one of Elia's longtime acquaintances. This visit was no coincidence. Pier Angelo later told investigators that they spent most of the night drinking and talking. But this was not completely true. Elia had taken prohibited substances and left around 3 a.m. Agitated and fueled by anger, Pier admitted that Elia talked about wanting revenge that night. But he insisted he had not taken the threats seriously. In his words, Elia's dark, sarcastic humor often blurred the line between a joke and something far more sinister. Further investigation revealed that after returning home, Elia immediately seized one of his father's rifles. He loaded the weapon and headed straight to his parents' bedroom. He fired 2 shots at his mother and 2 more at his father. Though gravely wounded, his father managed to stagger toward the garage in a desperate attempt to escape. His mother tried to fight back, but she was overpowered almost instantly. Elia then moved to the living room, where his older brother, Enrico, was asleep. Enrico had already been jolted awake by the gunfire. He was shot twice as well. After he lost consciousness, Elia began staging the scene as a robbery. He scattered various objects throughout the house, took one of the family rifles along with ammunition, and fled the home. Despite his injuries, Enrico managed to call emergency services. In the hours that followed, Elia contacted several acquaintances and transferred yet another large sum of money to his girlfriend in the Dominican Republic. By dawn, he was already inside a taxi headed toward the Swiss border. His flight was short-lived, thanks to a rapid international alert. Swiss authorities stopped him at a border checkpoint. His strange demeanor raised immediate suspicion, and the guards detained him before notifying the Italian Carabinieri. Shortly thereafter, Elia was interrogated. He confessed to the triple homicide almost immediately. What shocked investigators most was his utter lack of remorse. His behavior from the very beginning suggested profound psychological instability. Mental health professionals evaluated him and diagnosed him with borderline personality disorder. He struggled with explosive anger, impulsivity, and a severe dependence on hard prohibited substances, yet no one had ever ensured he received treatment in a specialized facility. When speaking about his past, Elia often described the family environment as far from harmonious. Contrary to the image the Del Grande family presented to the outside world, he recalled with bitterness the years he spent living with his grandmother and aunt, describing them as a time of deep loneliness. According to him, both women resorted to physical punishment to control him. He said, feeling unloved and mistreated had caused lasting psychological trauma. Elia portrayed his mother not as a warm, affectionate figure, but as a harsh, controlling woman who used yelling, insults, and physical discipline to enforce her rules. His father, he claimed, was no different. Psychiatric experts later testified that such an upbringing, combined with his personality traits, could have contributed to his chronic low self-esteem, emotional instability, and the persistent feeling of being judged or monitored. These factors, together with his escalating substance abuse, likely accelerated his psychological decline. After his first trial, Elia Del Grande received 3 life sentences. However, during the appeal, the court reduced the sentence to 30 years, ruling that he was only partially sane at the time of the killings. Even in prison, Elia's behavior continued to deteriorate. He attempted to escape multiple times and provoked frequent conflicts despite the high security conditions. One escape attempt actually succeeded, though only briefly. Investigators later concluded that he may have been assisted by his common-law wife, whom he had met while on a semi-open prison regime. A taxi driver proved instrumental in identifying him. He had been paid 400 euros by a woman to pick up someone outside the prison perimeter. During the ride, the driver noticed that the passenger kept hiding his face. Suspicious, he went to the police after completing the trip, helping authorities track down and recapture Elia. Elia was captured while trying to reach Sardinia and received an additional 8-month sentence. In practice, though, it made little difference, because he did not end up serving the full 30 years. Then came an unexpected, highly controversial development. In 2025, after serving just 25 years, Elia was granted early release, transferred to a semi-open facility in Olbia, Sardinia. The decision sparked immediate outrage. Residents were furious and frightened at the prospect of living near a man who had killed his entire family and who had repeatedly shown he was capable of violence. And almost immediately, Elia validated their fears. From the very first days, it became clear that he could not adjust to ordinary life. He frequently argued with neighbors, clashed with residents, and provoked multiple complaints. Some said he harassed people. Others insisted he was simply too dangerous to be living freely within the community. As a result, his freedom was restricted once again. A court ordered him to spend 6 months in a work-release facility in Castelfranco Emilia, in the province of Modena, after which his case would be reviewed again. This institution was a mixed facility where inmates of different profiles lived together. At the time of Elia's transfer, around 40 individuals classified as dangerous to society were housed there, along with another 45 prisoners in various stages of social reintegration. Many had already been granted semi-freedom, which allowed them to go into town each day for work. The decision to house a convicted triple murderer in such an environment was met with significant criticism. Even law enforcement officers acknowledged that criminals with vastly different behavioral patterns required different levels of supervision. That reality soon became painfully clear. On the evening of October 30, 2025, Elia managed to escape. Using a makeshift rope crafted from electrical cords taken from household appliances, he lowered himself from a window located on the only side of the building, not protected by fencing. No one realized he was gone until the next morning's head count. Surveillance cameras captured his escape. A large-scale search operation began immediately. But the first hours yielded nothing. No inmates in the facility appeared to know anything about Elia's plan, and he left behind no obvious clues. After examining his background, detectives concluded that he was likely still in Italy, probably hiding in areas familiar to him. Patrols searched roads, bus terminals, train stations, rural paths, and abandoned farmhouses. Dozens of CCTV recordings were collected, but none led to him. Then Elia reached out himself. On November 6, Novosti Varese received a letter signed by Elia Del Grande. In it, he attempted to justify his escape. He expressed remorse for his past actions but insisted he could not remain in the workhouse. He criticized the reintegration facility, describing it as a poor imitation of a real prison, one that lacked meaningful rehabilitation programs. He claimed that psychotropic medications and prohibited substances circulated freely inside, and that many inmates were forced to remain far longer than necessary simply because they had no home or family waiting for them outside. According to Elia, his escape was not an attempt to avoid punishment, but a choice driven by desperation, a way to spend the rest of his life in a more peaceful place. The letter ignited nationwide debate. On one hand, complaints about such institutions had existed for years. On the other, a man who had murdered his entire family was openly on the run and considered extremely dangerous. Authorities intensified their search. Eventually, investigators traced Elia to Lake Monate. Under cover of darkness, he used a pedal boat to cross the lake, temporarily eluding patrols on the ground. But his efforts only delayed the inevitable. After 13 days on the run, on November 12, 2025, officers located him hiding in a small house near his childhood home in Cadrazate. He offered no resistance when arrested. The investigation into his escape is still ongoing. As detectives suspect, he did not act alone. Now 50 years old, Elia Del Grande has been returned to custody. Even so, Elia is expected to be released again in just 4 years. His case has sparked national reflection, not only about public safety, but also about the structure and limitations of the Italian justice system. One question remains at the center of the debate. Can someone who murdered his entire family ever truly reintegrate into society? In the peaceful town of Monroe, North Carolina, Kimberly Medlin thought she understood the sources of danger in her life. She worried about intoxicated patrons at the club, unfamiliar people on desolate roads. However, she never suspected that the true danger was observing her, not from the shadows, but from behind the wheel of a police car, studying her routines, tendencies, and anxieties. This is not just the story of a brutal murder. It is the story of how one man turned the symbol of safety into a hunting license, and how a young woman who did everything right never made it home. Kimberly Jo Kim Millen Medlin was born on December 1, 1970. She was cheerful, bright-spirited, and had a warm, welcoming smile. People were naturally drawn to her. After graduating high school, she met the love of her life, a young man named Bridger Medlin. Around that time, she began pursuing her education and working steadily. The couple later married and settled on a small horse farm in Monroe, North Carolina. By 1997, Kim was both a student and a hard-working young woman balancing 2 jobs to support her small family. She was a passionate horseback rider, dreamed of owning her own riding stable one day. Bridger worked tirelessly as well. Together, they planned to finish school, build stable careers, and eventually start a family. But they had no idea that fate was quietly preparing something far darker. Kim worked as a sales associate at a clothing store and also waited tables at a popular men's club in the city. It was a loud, high-energy environment where fights sometimes broke out among intoxicated customers or occasionally even between staff. This happened often enough that Kim hardly reacted to it anymore. She and her co-workers knew how to handle rowdy patrons. Security guards typically diffused situations before they escalated. This wasn't always effective, but the establishment was well known to law enforcement. A police officer could always be called if a situation got out of hand. Such incidents occurred during Kim's shifts, but they were rare, and she managed them with her usual calm. But none of that could protect her from what happened early one March morning in 1997 as she drove home from work. At first, Kim noticed that an unfamiliar vehicle seemed to be following her as she left the club. She changed lanes, slowed down, and sped up to test her suspicion, but the car mimicked her every move. Fearful, she contacted law enforcement. By the time she pulled up behind a patrol car parked along a quiet stretch of road, the pursuer had already sped away. Perhaps realizing his intentions had been discovered, he avoided a direct encounter with the police. Deeply shaken, Kim explained the frightening incident to the officers. They took her statement seriously, reassured her, and opened a report. She admitted this wasn't the first time she had noticed someone suspicious trailing her. Officers documented everything carefully, though the details were too limited to identify the stalker. Even so, they had no intention of ignoring her warning. From that moment on, patrol officers were alerted about the suspicious individual and his vehicle. Kim returned to her routine, working and studying as usual. Only 2 weeks passed after she filed the report. At 4:00 a.m. on March 29, 1997, an officer on patrol spotted a red SUV pulled over on the side of the road. It didn't look like an accident. The vehicle appeared abandoned. Its engine was running, the headlights were still on, and no one was inside. When officers began examining the car, the situation immediately became alarming. Inside, they found signs of a struggle, strands of light-colored hair and several small drops of blood on the driver's side. Kim's belongings were inside: her wallet, cash, cards, and various personal items. A quick check of the license plates confirmed that the vehicle belonged to Kimberly Jo Kim Millen Medlin. But Kim herself was nowhere in sight. And just like that, a quiet countryside road became the beginning of one of North Carolina's most unsettling murder cases. The first call investigators made was to Kim's home, but no one answered. Early that same morning, her husband, Bridger Medlin, arrived at the police station in person to report that his wife had not returned home after her shift at the men's club. There was no logical explanation for Kim's disappearance, and Bridger was visibly shaken. He remembered the frightening incident weeks earlier when someone had followed her on the road, and he feared that one of the club's customers, or perhaps the same stalker, might have harmed his wife. The abandoned SUV suggested that something terrible had happened. Detectives had already processed the vehicle and found nothing of significant value inside, so they moved on to the surrounding area. Outside, they noticed markings on the ground, what looked like a faint, disturbed trail. Following it and widening the search perimeter, investigators made a grim discovery the very next day. Kim's body had been dumped at the end of a dead-end road, roughly 3 kilometers from where her SUV had been found. Nothing had been taken from the vehicle. Jewelry was still on her body, her wedding ring remained on her finger, and a gold bracelet was still on her wrist. It was immediately clear this had not been a robbery. Kim had been brutally beaten. According to the autopsy, she sustained multiple blows, punched, kicked, and strangled over a prolonged period. There were no signs of abuse, but her back and neck were covered in severe bruises. Many of the marks had a distinctive shape, yet they did not match any common weapon either. The violence had been intense and deliberate. Even in areas of skin that are usually thick and therefore less prone to bruising, deep bruises can still be found. The perpetrator seemed to harbor fierce hatred for his victim. Based on the injuries, Kim appeared to have been ambushed from behind, forced to the ground, and subjected to immense pressure on her back and neck, possibly from the killer stomping on her, causing fractures. There was also evidence indicating she had been restrained. Marks around her wrists suggested immobilization, though no bindings were recovered at the scene. The impressions did not match tape, rope, or zip ties. Experienced forensic experts noted the pattern was highly unusual. To understand who might have attacked the defenseless young woman, detectives began reconstructing her final hours. Her family and close friends cooperated fully. On the surface, none of the people in Kim's life seemed aggressive or dangerous. She had no history of mental illness, substance dependency, or risky social circles. She lived quietly and stayed away from trouble. The only environment that raised concern was her workplace. The men's club drew a wide range of customers, and tensions could escalate easily. Investigators questioned her co-workers, many of whom believed Kim's killer was likely a problematic patron. According to Kim's colleagues, she had finished her shift around 2 o'clock a.m. As usual, they also provided her complaint about being followed on the street, which they believe is relevant. The detectives then questioned her husband. Bridger confirmed that she called him at that time to let him know she was leaving the club, a routine she never broke. Phone records later verified his statement. Her commute normally lasted only 10 minutes. To save time, she always took a quiet, isolated shortcut road. It was along that same road that her SUV had been discovered, engine running, lights on, but driver missing. Bridger said that after speaking to Kim, he went to bed, exhausted from his long day at work. But when he woke up and started getting ready for his shift, he realized Kim had never returned home and immediately contacted police. His missing person report was filed, but detectives soon identified 2 concerning inconsistencies. First, no one could confirm that Bridger was actually home at the time he claimed. Only the phone record proved Kim had called the house. After that call, he had more than enough time to commit the crime. Second, detectives questioned his account of falling asleep so easily. How could he have gone to bed without waiting for his wife to return from a late-night shift? And how did he not notice her absence until morning? His delayed report raised doubts. Despite these concerns, Bridger behaved calmly and appeared devastated. At first glance, he seemed suspicious, but he acted very calmly. He seemed like a sincerely grieving widower who had lost his beloved. When investigators began verifying Bridger Medlin's statements, several witnesses stepped forward claiming they had seen a black van resembling his driving through town around the time Kim went missing. Bridger firmly denied any involvement, insisting he had been home the entire night. Detectives still lacked evidence to charge him with anything. But the conflicting accounts forced them to slow down and re-examine every detail. Family, friends, and colleagues were interviewed extensively to help investigators understand the dynamics of the couple's relationship. Everyone described Bridger as attentive, hard-working, and deeply devoted to his wife. Like any married couple, they had minor disagreements, but nothing even close to violent or hostile. Detectives tried to identify a motive, yet none emerged. The Medlins had no life insurance policies, no significant assets, no children, no affairs, and no discussions of divorce, factors that often contribute to spousal homicides. Suspicion surrounding Bridger weakened further when another witness came forward, claiming that Bridger's van had remained parked in the driveway all night. Although his alibi was far from airtight, investigators no longer considered him their primary focus. Attention shifted to other avenues. Based on the timeline, Kim had called her husband before driving home. She then continued along her usual route, a quiet suburban stretch of highway, before stopping unexpectedly. There was nothing on that road to make her pull over voluntarily. Detectives began to suspect that Kim had stopped because she believed she was being pulled over by law enforcement. This theory also explained the unusual marks on her wrists. Forensic examiners recognized the pattern instantly: pressure injuries consistent with metal handcuffs applied far too tightly. Then, an unexpected development occurred. A man arrived at the police station, claiming he was the same driver Kim had reported weeks earlier, the one who followed her from the men's club. He insisted he had nothing to do with her murder. He admitted he had been drunk that night and acted out of anger because Kim had removed him from the club 2 weeks earlier for inappropriate behavior. Wanting to scare her, he followed her car, but backed off when she neared a location where patrol officers usually parked. He said he came forward because he had heard that a waitress from the club had been killed and didn't want police hunting for him. His confession seemed genuine, but his alibi still had to be checked. Investigators soon confirmed he was telling the truth. On the night of Kim's murder, he had been at work during an overnight shift. Multiple co-workers and his manager backed him up. CCTV footage with timestamps also confirmed his presence. He was ruled out completely. And just like that, the list of suspects was empty again. Detectives felt trapped in a standstill. No one believed Bridger was guilty, neither Kim's family nor his own. Everyone knew him as a gentle, even-tempered man. The marriage showed no signs of trouble. There was still no motive at all. With no progress, investigators held a press conference, hoping someone from the public had seen something unusual on that isolated road during the early morning hours. Their request paid off. A motorist came forward, saying he had seen a patrol car following a vehicle matching the description of Kim's red SUV. He explained that he had driven behind both vehicles for a short distance and noticed how unnaturally synchronized their movements were, close enough to raise concern. At the time, he dismissed it. Only after watching the news did he realize the significance. Investigators showed him photographs of patrol cars from nearby jurisdictions. Based on the details he remembered, they concluded the car appeared to be a Monroe Police Department patrol vehicle. The possibility was chilling. The killer might have been someone wearing a badge. Because all patrol cars in Monroe were identical models, the witness could not identify the exact unit number, but his account aligned perfectly with the new theory. It explained why Kim had stopped on a deserted highway. She likely believed she was being pulled over by an officer she trusted, or at least someone who looked like one. By this point, investigators had already analyzed every piece of evidence they collected, but the new lead forced them to re-examine everything, especially hoping to find fingerprints or trace materials they might have missed the first time. Unfortunately, nothing useful surfaced. That was not entirely surprising. If the killer really was connected to law enforcement, he would have known exactly how to avoid leaving any trace behind. A follow-up inspection finally revealed something investigators had overlooked: a distinctive imprint left on Kim's sweatshirt. Forensic analysis determined that it was the heel mark of a woman's shoe, not a sneaker or standard boot. Alongside it was another peculiar marking, a small V-shaped imprint. The experts began searching for the manufacturer. At first, he found nothing. No popular brands used a heel design or lettering like this. He then shifted to small-scale or specialized footwear producers. He examined hundreds of models, visited stores in person, and checked suppliers who made shoes for niche professions. That was when he found an exact match. The shoes were produced by a small manufacturer in Wisconsin, a company so specialized and obscure that even in that industry, few people had heard of it. They made only a few dozen models, and one of them had the exact same heel pattern and the same letter imprint found on Kim's clothing. The next step was to determine the killer's size. By reconstructing the pressure marks and depth of the imprint, the forensic lab concluded that the perpetrator wore size 39-40. In only a matter of days, the focus of the investigation narrowed dramatically. The killer was likely a Monroe police officer wearing this rare shoe model. When detectives checked the boots of officers in the department, they found 3 who owned this exact model. 1 wore size 39 and 2 wore size 40. The first officer worked for the fire division and had been on duty the entire night of the murder. He had no connection to Kim, did not frequent the men's club, and had a strong, independently verified alibi. He was immediately removed from the list. The second officer had spent the night investigating a robbery. He was stationed at an elderly couple's house on the opposite end of town and remained in constant radio contact with dispatch. His alibi was airtight. The third officer was Josh Griffin. On the night Kim was murdered, Griffin had worked until 10 p.m. According to his statement, he went straight home afterward. What immediately drew attention was that he had patrolled the very stretch of highway where Kim's abandoned SUV was later found. Griffin claimed he had seen nothing unusual that night, no stopped vehicles, no suspicious activity. In theory, this made sense. By the time Kimberly left the men's club around 2 a.m., Josh Griffin should have been asleep at home. He insisted that after his shift he did nothing else, saying he had been too exhausted to leave his house. Investigators inspected Griffin's patrol car first. What they found was unsettling. The inside of the vehicle was spotless, as if it had been aggressively cleaned very recently. They immediately flagged this as suspicious. Griffin had a reputation for being exceptionally untidy. For years, the department joked that his patrol car was the filthiest in the fleet, and that anyone riding with him practically needed to wash their clothes afterward. Yet now, after Kim's murder, the same car was immaculate, cleaner than it had ever been since the day it was issued to him. Griffin dismissed the comments, insisting everyone was exaggerating, but investigators' suspicions were already growing. When detectives searched Griffin's home, they were especially interested in his footwear. The distinctive boots he was known to wear, the exact model that matched the imprint on Kim's sweatshirt, were nowhere to be found. When questioned, Josh claimed he had thrown them away because they had torn during his last investigation. But according to multiple colleagues, Griffin wore that particular model constantly and had never mentioned them being damaged. Suspicions surrounding Officer Josh Griffin grew even stronger. Once investigators revisited interviews with Kim's colleagues at the men's club, they confirmed that Josh was a familiar face there, a regular customer known for his temper, unsettling behavior. He often acted defiant, used his badge as a shield to intimidate people. He was generally avoided by both staff and patrons. Female employees, in particular, recalled how disrespectful and aggressive he could be. But everything changed when he first noticed Kim. It was clear he was immediately drawn to her. He repeatedly tried to strike up conversations, but Kim, modest, reserved, and married, turned him down every time. She did not like Josh, and the two had engaged in several verbal confrontations at the club, though none were serious enough to warrant formal complaints. Investigators now needed to dismantle Josh's alibi, which claimed he had been home asleep at the time of the murder. They seized his cell phone as part of the investigation. The records revealed a call made at 2 a.m. Not from his home, but from his patrol car. Despite the limited precision of cell tower triangulation at the time, detectives determined he had been parked at an intersection just outside the men's club parking lot. The spot provided a perfect view of the club entrance. It was now clear that Josh had not been home at all. When confronted with these findings, he changed his story. He claimed that after his shift ended, he had simply stayed in his patrol car to read a book. The call at 2 a.m., he said, was him requesting a tow truck for a stranger who had approached him for help with a broken-down vehicle. This new explanation only raised more questions. According to the timeline, Kim drove past that exact intersection roughly 30 minutes later, taking her usual shortcut home. Josh Griffin, therefore, had ample opportunity to follow her without raising suspicion, as he was in full uniform and driving a marked police car. Even so, Josh continued to deny any involvement. Because the evidence was still circumstantial, he was released pending further investigation. More troubling information emerged shortly afterward. Several of Griffin's co-workers admitted they had heard him talk repeatedly about a girl in a red SUV he found attractive. He had made comments, some inappropriate, about Kim more than once. It became clear that his interest in her was not casual but obsessive. As rumors spread that the killer might be a police officer, Monroe's police department initially resisted the idea. No one wanted a scandal implicating one of their own, but the leak proved unexpectedly helpful. Multiple young women came forward reporting that a patrol officer had harassed them. They described being followed in their cars, approached on isolated roads, and confronted in public places. The pattern was unmistakable. Josh Griffin had used his badge to intimidate women for years. But Kim had rejected him firmly, and that rejection only intensified his fixation. Soon the theory became clear. Investigators believed Griffin had driven to the area near the club specifically because he knew Kim would be leaving work. He had studied her routine and waited until the perfect moment. They suspected he followed her onto the rural road where she usually drove home. Then, using the authority of his uniform and patrol car, he forced her to pull over. She likely believed it was an ordinary traffic stop, until she realized the truth. Detectives reconstructed the likely sequence of events. Griffin handcuffed Kim, dragged her off the road, and launched into a sustained attack. He beat her, choked her using what was likely a police flashlight, and applied such force to her neck, back that he fractured her vertebrae, standing on her body with full weight. That was when the distinctive heel imprint from his shoe pressed into her sweatshirt. In February 1998, Josh Griffin was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. He continued to deny all accusations, but the evidence against him had grown overwhelming. During the preliminary hearing, numerous witnesses testified, including the motorist who had reported seeing a patrol car tailing Kim's SUV, several officers who worked alongside Griffin, and multiple women who had previously been harassed by him. The defense attempted to portray Griffin as a respectable officer, but the community knew better. Witness after witness described his volatile temper, inappropriate comments, and reckless abuse of authority. In February 1998, after closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a unanimous verdict. Josh Griffin was found guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Years went by before Griffin finally requested a recorded interview with investigators. In that meeting, he admitted to everything. He said he couldn't fully explain what pushed him to commit such a horrific act, but he confirmed much of what detectives had long suspected. He acknowledged that he tried to approach Kim multiple times, and when she firmly rejected him, something inside him snapped. He confessed that he kidnapped her, handcuffed her, beat her, stomped on her, and strangled her with his police flashlight. After killing her, he took her driver's license. Griffin said he tore it into tiny pieces and flushed them down the toilet. As for the missing pair of shoes, he admitted that he discarded them in a dumpster behind a local supermarket on the same morning of the murder. He realized those distinctive footprints could track him down and panicked. By confessing, Josh Griffin said he finally felt he had cleared his conscience. His sentence, however, remains unchanged. What happened to Kim is more than a tragic crime. It is a warning, a reminder that power without integrity becomes a weapon, and that the people we depend on the most can sometimes be the ones who betray that trust in the most horrific way. Kimberly Jo Kim Millen Medlin was a daughter, a wife, a friend, a woman with dreams, goals, and a future that should never have been stolen. Her story continues to echo through Monroe. That morning in Northwest Houston started like any other. The street was quiet, the houses looked the same, and there were no sounds of sirens or screams. But behind the closed door of a house on Emma Forrest Street, An unnatural silence had fallen. On March 12, 2025, 32-year-old Kristen Chavez was found dead inside her own home, a place that should have been safe. People quickly realized that she had been murdered. The prime suspect was the person closest to her, her husband. There was no need for a manhunt. He was still at the house when the police arrived. There was blood, a common household object used as a weapon, and 4 dogs were missing, having disappeared sometime before Kristen's death. The mystery was, what happened in those last, quiet hours, as if nothing violent had ever taken place? The story begins with a door in Northwest Houston and a moment that feels too still for mourning. On March 12, 2025, Kristen Chavez, 32, is found dead inside her home on Emma Forest Street in the Oak Forest area. Pronounced at the scene, her death is quickly treated as a homicide. A single fact anchors the first hours. Police say her husband, Chance Chavez, 34, is arrested and charged with murder. Outside, the neighborhood looks like any other. Lawns, driveways, the quiet geometry of ordinary life. Inside, investigators are faced with a kind of violence that doesn't fit the setting. Court reporting later describes an iron split, damage linked by prosecutors to the attack, a domestic object reframed as a weapon. The air around the case turns cold fast, not because the public knows everything, but because they know enough. A woman is dead, the suspect is close, the scene is personal. According to the reporting on what officers encountered, Chance Chavez is at the home when police arrive. Prosecutors would later describe him with blood on his body and clothing, raising his hands as if surrendering. It is an early investigative turning point, not a long search, not a stranger in the dark, but a case that collapses inward toward the people already inside the frame. And then there is the detail that doesn't belong to the script of a typical call-out. Family members and local reporting say Kristen's dogs, 4 of them, were allegedly taken and abandoned along the Katy Freeway hours before she was found. It lands like a flare over the city, a clue, a distraction, or a signature, something that invites witnesses, tips, and public emotion before investigators have even finished photographing the walls. One fact is clear, early. Kristen is gone, and the investigation begins at home. The feeling is harder to quantify. A closed door can hold an entire storm. The leading question tightens as daylight spreads across Emma Forest Street. If the evidence points inward so quickly, what was happening in the hours before police arrived? The case is only opening, but already it's moving toward the past, toward the marriage, toward the patterns investigators look for when violence erupts in private. Before the violence becomes public record, Kristen exists in quieter facts. She is 32 years old. She lives in Northwest Houston. She works. She keeps dogs. She has a routine that, until it breaks, appears ordinary. According to family statements and early reporting, nothing in the days immediately before her death suggests she was planning to disappear. There is no packed bag, no goodbye message, no sign she is preparing to leave her life behind. The silence comes abruptly. Friends and relatives later describe Kristen as close to her family, engaged with her everyday world, and anchored by responsibilities that assume a future. The home in Emma Forest is not described as temporary. It is a place of settling, yet, according to accounts shared after her death, there are hints, small, incomplete, of strain inside the marriage. Nothing formally documented as criminal, nothing that triggers outside intervention. The kind of tension that often remains private until it can no longer. Investigators working backward focus on routine because routine is what collapses first. Phone activity, daily movements, whether she answered messages, whether she showed up where she was expected. According to the investigation file, there is no evidence that Kristen leaves the house alive after a certain point. Her world narrows to the interior of her home, to a timeline measured in hours rather than days. The dogs become part of that backward walk. Family members would later say they believe the dogs were removed from the home before Kristen's death. That detail matters because it suggests forethought, an action taken not in panic, but in preparation. It reframes the hours before the killing as a sequence, not an explosion. Someone is thinking ahead. Someone is making choices. Emotion enters the case through absence. Kristen does not call anyone for help. There is no confirmed emergency call from her phone. No neighbor reports hearing a disturbance loud enough to trigger a police response. The house holds its secret long enough for the night to pass into morning. That quiet weighs heavily in domestic homicide investigations, where violence often unfolds without witnesses and ends before anyone outside knows to listen. Police attention begins to settle on the relationship itself, not because of gossip, but because statistics and case history demand it. Intimate partners are always examined first. Alibis are tested, timelines are tightened, financial and digital records are flagged for later review. At this stage, investigators are not proving guilt. They are establishing context. Who had access? Who had a motive? Who was present when the silence began? One fact remains steady. Kristen does not leave her home alive. The feeling beneath it is unease, the sense that whatever happened was not spontaneous, but building quietly behind closed doors. And the question investigators cannot avoid is simple and heavy. If the warning signs were subtle, what did they add up to in the final hours before her voice went quiet? When investigators step inside the house on Emma Forest, the scene does not shout. It tells its story slowly. According to court filings and police statements, Kristen was found with fatal injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. The medical examiner will later confirm homicide. The fact is stark. The atmosphere is colder still. This is not a break-in, not a chaotic ransacking. It is a domestic space altered by violence, where everyday objects remain close at hand. Among those objects is an iron. Prosecutors will later identify it as the alleged weapon. Its presence matters because it anchors the crime in the ordinary. No firearm brought from outside. No blade is hidden on a person. Something is already in the house. Something within reach. According to the investigation file, the iron is damaged, split in a way consistent with repeated force. That detail becomes a pivot. It suggests not a single impulsive strike, but sustained violence. Blood evidence reinforces that reading. Investigators document blood on the suspect's body and clothing, and blood at the scene. The distribution is important. It places violence inside the home and ties it to proximity. There is no indication of an attempt to clean the scene before the police arrive. No elaborate staging. The story the house tells is one of immediacy events that moved faster than any plan to conceal them afterward. Yet the crime scene also raises restraint questions. There are no signs of forced entry, no broken doors or windows. That absence narrows the field. It supports a theory that Kristen knew the person who killed her. Someone she allowed close. Someone is already inside. In domestic homicide cases, this pattern is familiar, and investigators treat it carefully, aware of how often familiarity becomes leverage. Time becomes the next variable. When exactly did the assault occur? How long was Kristen alone afterward? According to police, the timeline is reconstructed through phone data, witness statements, and the discovery of her body. There is no confirmed emergency call from her phone, no final message. The silence is total. It suggests the violence was sudden and overwhelming, leaving no space to reach outside the room. One fact crystallizes as evidence is logged and photographed. The crime scene does not point outward. It points inward, toward the relationship and the hours immediately before the killing. The feeling it leaves behind is claustrophobic, the sense of a life ending without escape, inside familiar walls. And the question investigators carry forward is unavoidable. If the house tells the truth, why were steps allegedly taken outside its steps involving the dogs before Kristen was killed? Hours before Kristen is found dead, something happens that does not fit the quiet geometry of the house. According to family members and early reporting cited in the investigation file, 4 of Kristen's dogs were allegedly removed from the home and abandoned along the Katy Freeway. Some are found wandering near traffic, others are recovered later. The fact is unusual enough to pull the case into public view almost immediately. For investigators, the dogs are not a sideshow. They are a timeline marker, living evidence that someone left the house, traveled a distance, and made deliberate choices before returning or not returning. This is not an act that happens during a sudden fight. It requires time, transportation, intention. It introduces the idea of sequencing, suggesting that events unfolded in stages rather than a single moment of loss of control. The image of domesticated animals left in danger resonates far beyond the courtroom. It triggers calls, tips, outrage. But detectives work to strip away emotion and focus on function. Why remove the dogs at all? In domestic homicide investigations, animals often represent obstacles, witnesses that bark, disruptions that draw attention. Their removal can indicate planning, or at least an attempt to create conditions for privacy. The freeway itself matters. The Katy Freeway is busy, visible, and unpredictable. Abandoning animals there risks public discovery. That risk raises questions. Was the goal to permanently get rid of them, or simply to remove them from the house temporarily? Investigators consider whether this act was meant to delay discovery, prevent interference, or serve as a distraction. According to the investigation file, there is no evidence that the dogs were harmed, but their abandonment is treated as an intentional act tied to the larger sequence of events. Witness accounts become critical here. Drivers, passers-by, anyone who may have seen a vehicle stop, doors open, and animals released. This is where a private crime brushes against public space. Surveillance cameras, traffic cameras, cell phone pings. The investigation widens briefly, not to look for a stranger, but to document movement. One fact anchors the theory building: the dogs are allegedly gone before Kristen's death. The feeling surrounding that fact is deeply unsettling, a sense that choices were made in advance of violence. And the question investigators begin to ask grows sharper. If someone took the time to remove the dogs, what does that say about what they believed was coming next? The case tightens as attention turns back toward the person police say was inside the house when they arrived. The next layer is not about animals or highways, but about a suspect standing in the doorway of the crime scene itself. When police arrive at the house on Emma Forest, they do not search the neighborhood. They do not set up roadblocks. According to police statements and court reporting, the suspect is already there. Chance, Kristen's husband, is at the home when officers make contact. The fact is immediate and inescapable. This is not a case that unfolds over miles. It collapses into a single address. Prosecutors later describe what officers observe: blood on Chance's body and clothing, his hands raised. His presence is framed by the doorway of the house where Kristen is dead inside. According to the investigation file, this moment becomes a critical anchor point. It shortens the investigative arc dramatically. Instead of asking who might have entered the home, detectives focus on what happened between the two people who lived there. Arrests in domestic homicide cases are often quiet, procedural, no chase, no dramatic confession, just a tightening of handcuffs and a shift from scene management to case building. Chance is taken into custody and later charged with murder. The legal language is firm, but restrained. Allegations, not conclusions. Evidence, not verdicts. Investigators begin constructing the suspect profile not from rumor, but from proximity and access. He had keys. He had time. He had an opportunity. These are not assumptions. They are logistical facts. Detectives review phone records, financial activity, and movements tied to his name. They examine injuries. They document statements. At this stage, inconsistencies matter more than motives. The goal is not to explain why, but to establish what can be proven. The defense posture has not yet fully emerged, but the outline is familiar. Presence does not equal guilt. Blood can be explained. Silence can be strategic. Investigators know this. That is why physical evidence becomes central. The alleged weapon, the condition of the scene, the absence of forced entry, the dogs on the freeway. Each detail either tightens or loosens the narrative around the suspect. Emotion enters not through courtroom arguments, but through contrast. A husband, a home, a body discovered within shared walls. The feeling is one of compression lives, evidence, and timelines pressing inward toward a single figure without yet delivering a final answer. Public attention intensifies, but the case remains disciplined, bound by what can be introduced under oath. One fact stands above the rest. Chance is the only person police publicly identify and charge. The atmosphere around him is tense, unresolved, and the question that now drives the investigation forward is unavoidable: if he is responsible. What pushed the situation from private strain into irreversible violence? That question leads investigators deeper into motive, pressure, and what may have been building beneath the surface long before police crossed the threshold. With the suspect identified and charged, the investigation shifts from proximity to pressure. Why is it always the hardest question? According to prosecutors, motive is not a single moment but an accumulation. Detectives begin examining the space between Kristen and Chance Chavez, where arguments, expectations, and control may have lived long before the night turned violent. Financial records come under scrutiny, bank accounts, spending patterns, obligations are shared and separate. According to court discussions referenced in public reporting, investigators look for stressors that could sharpen conflict debts, disputes over money, or pressures tied to maintaining a household. Nothing here is dramatic on its own. It rarely is. Motive often hides in mundane details that, over time, gain weight. Control becomes another investigative lens. In domestic homicide cases, violence is often preceded by attempts to manage space, movement, or autonomy. The alleged removal of the dogs returns to the foreground, not as an emotional act, but as a functional one. Prosecutors suggest it may reflect an effort to control the environment, to reduce noise, resistance, or interference. If true, it reframes the act as preparation rather than panic. This is where cases become uncomfortable. The evidence no longer sits on a table, it stretches into daily life. Phone records are examined for tone as much as timing. Messages are read not for romance, but for strain. According to the investigation file, there is no indication of an external affair or third-party intrusion driving events. The focus remains inward. At this stage, the prosecution does not need to prove motive beyond a reasonable doubt. They need coherence, a narrative that aligns actions with outcomes. The iron, the blood, the dogs, the absence of forced entry, the presence of the accused. Each piece does not scream motive, but together they suggest escalation, a situation that crossed a line rather than erupted from nothing. Emotion in this phase is subdued but ominous. Motive building is slow and methodical. It lacks spectacle, but it sharpens the case. For the family of Kristen, this is where grief meets explanation, though explanation does not equal comfort. Understanding why does not undo what happened. One fact remains central. Prosecutors continue to hold Chance as the sole suspect. The feeling surrounding that fact is tightening inevitability, as if the case is drawing breath before the next legal shift. And the question now facing the court is not just what happened, but how firmly the evidence will hold when tested publicly. That test begins not at the crime scene, but in a courtroom where bond, control, and credibility come into sharp focus. The case moves from the house to the courtroom without losing its weight. Chance stands before a judge, no longer framed by a doorway, but by procedure. According to court records and reporting from the bond hearing, prosecutors argue that the evidence against him is strong and the risk he poses is serious. The charge is murder. The facts presented are measured, not theatrical. Blood evidence, presence at the scene, the alleged weapon, the dogs. Each element is introduced not to persuade the public, but to justify restraint. Bond becomes the focal point. It is not about guilt or innocence. It is about control. Prosecutors request a high bond, pointing to the severity of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it. They argue that release could pose a danger, or at a minimum, undermine the integrity of the process. The defense counters with familiar ground, no prior convictions, community ties, the presumption of innocence. This is the legal rhythm of early homicide cases, where both sides are positioning for what comes next. The judge listens, weighs. According to reporting, the bond is set at a level that reflects the gravity of the charge. It is a procedural decision, but it carries symbolic weight. It signals how the court views the strength of the case at this stage, not as a conclusion, but as a threshold crossed. The atmosphere in the courtroom is restrained, almost clinical. There are no outbursts, no dramatic testimony, yet the tension is unmistakable. Kristen is absent, but present in every reference to the victim. Her name is spoken carefully. Her life was reduced, for now, to evidentiary relevance. This is how the system works, even when it feels insufficient. Public reaction simmers outside the courtroom. The detail of the dogs, the domestic setting, the immediacy of the arrest all have already shaped opinion. But inside, the case remains insulated from emotion. Judges do not rule on outrage. They rule on risk, law, and precedent. Control, again, becomes the quiet theme. Who controls the narrative? Who controls movement? Who controls the pace of justice? One fact is now fixed. Chance remains charged with murder as the case moves forward. The feeling is one of suspended gravity, as if everything is held in place, waiting. And the question that lingers is larger than this single hearing. How will this case resolve when evidence is tested fully, and what will remain for those left behind when the legal process ends? That question carries the story beyond verdicts and bond amounts, into the aftermath where justice intersects with memory, and where the consequences of violence continue long after the courtroom empties. After the courtroom quiets, the case does not end. It lingers. Kristen Chavez's name remains attached to filings, hearings, and headlines, but for her family, the aftermath is not procedural. It is permanent. According to public statements and reporting, those closest to her are left navigating two parallel realities: the legal process, unfolding in slow motion, and the absence that never pauses. One fact defines the outcome at this stage. Kristen is dead, and her husband remains charged with her murder. The case has not yet reached final adjudication. There is no verdict carved in stone. Allegations remain allegations until proven in court. But the trajectory is set. Evidence has been logged. Timelines drawn. A suspect has been identified. The system has taken custody of the truth-seeking process. Domestic homicide cases rarely offer a clean closure, even when convictions occur. Answers can arrive without relief. Sentences can be handed down without healing. For Kristen's family, the future is divided into before and after, with no bridge between the two. The house in Emma Forest becomes a symbol not of home, but of rupture. Public attention fades, as it often does. New cases emerge, headlines shift, but certain details from this one persist in collective memory: the iron-turned weapon, the dogs on the freeway, the speed with which the investigation narrowed inward. These elements are not just facts, they are warnings. They illustrate how violence can coexist with routine, how danger can grow in familiar spaces without drawing notice until it is too late. Social lessons surface quietly. This case reinforces what research and case history have long shown. Domestic violence does not always announce itself. It escalates behind closed doors. It exploits trust, proximity, and silence. When it surfaces, it often does so catastrophically. Prevention depends not only on law enforcement but on awareness, intervention, and the willingness to take early signs seriously. Kristen Chavez is remembered not for how she died, but for the life that was interrupted, plans unfinished, relationships severed, a future removed from its own timeline. The justice system will continue its work, methodically, imperfectly. Whatever its final outcome, it cannot return what was taken. One fact remains unaltered by any ruling: Kristen's absence reshaped lives. The feeling left behind is quiet grief, layered with unease. And the question that endures, long after this case file closes, is one society must keep asking: how many warnings go unheard before silence becomes irreversible? This case ends here. The lesson does not. Made the tragedy even harder to comprehend. Now, investigators faced the enormous task of reconstructing every detail of the crime to identify whoever was responsible. At this time, Jennifer Harbison, 17 years old, is an energetic, ambitious, and hardworking girl. She was set to graduate the following year and planned to attend college afterward. Jennifer participated in sports and was a proud member, and even president, of the Future Farmers of America, a non-profit student organization focused on agricultural education. Her sister, 15-year-old Sarah, was also a student at the same school. She participated in the same organization, played basketball and volleyball, served on the student council, and was widely known as outgoing, energetic. She was dating a young man who had recently given her a ring as a symbol of his love. Tragically, that ring was later found melted beside her body. 17-year-old Eliza Thomas was also involved in the Future Farmers of America. She lived with her mother, while her father lived separately. During this period, she held 2 part-time jobs to help support her mom, even though she was still unsure of what she wanted to pursue in the future. The youngest victim, 13-year-old Amy Ayers, was a close friend of Sarah's. They didn't see each other regularly because they attended different schools, but whenever they spent time together, they enjoyed each other's company and fit naturally into the group. Amy is also a member of the same organization, Future Farmers of America, and it was through that program that she met everyone. Family members soon arrived at the scene. They cooperated fully with investigators and described the girl's day leading up to the tragedy. According to their account, Jennifer had visited her boyfriend that afternoon and then stopped by a friend's house before getting ready for her evening shift at the yogurt shop. She and Eliza were scheduled to work late, and afterward, Sarah's boyfriend was supposed to drive Jennifer home. Earlier that day, Amy and Sarah had gone to the stables, each responsible for an animal they were caring for. After leaving the stables, they decided to walk through the mall before heading to the yogurt shop to help Jennifer and Eliza close up for the night. Once closing time came, the plan was to drive home together, even though they lived nearby. This had become their usual routine for safety. Eliza's parents told investigators that nothing seemed unusual when they passed by the yogurt shop later that evening. They stopped to buy yogurt before heading home and saw no one suspicious. They also hadn't heard of any of the girls being stalked or involved in troubling relationships. None of them struggled with behavioral issues, and their rebellious phases were mild at most. Investigators then contacted the store manager. She remained composed until she was informed that 4 bodies had been found inside. The fire itself didn't initially alarm her. She was certain that no one should have been in the store at that hour. The situation felt deeply unsettling. Once it became clear that the scene was a crime scene, forensic experts arrived. They quickly determined that the girls had not died from smoke inhalation or burns. 3 of the victims, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah, had been shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber weapon. Amy suffered 2 gunshot wounds, and the bullets came from a different firearm. Because all 4 girls were found naked and bound, investigators initially suspected abuse or attempted assault, but the intense fire and the water used to extinguish it made confirming that difficult. Firefighters had washed down the entire area, likely destroying crucial evidence. What was clear, however, was that the fire had been intentionally set to cover up the crime. Cardboard boxes, napkins, and disposable cups had been stacked over the girls' bodies and ignited, turning the entire space into an inferno. There was no money left in the register, prompting speculation that robbery might have been a motive. Strangely, several of the girls' undergarments and 2 black jackets were missing, suggesting that personal items had been taken. Since there were no signs of forced entry, investigators considered the possibility that the victims may have known their killers. This would explain how the perpetrators gained access without suspicion. Yet detectives also believed the attackers might have simply been late customers. The police began questioning people within the girls' immediate circle. The first person to draw attention was Eliza's ex-boyfriend, Roger. Shortly before the murders, he had asked a friend to call the store while Eliza was working and inquire about all the yogurt flavors. Eliza overheard him laughing in the background. She mentioned the strange behavior to her parents and several friends. While it didn't seem dangerous, investigators followed up on the lead. It wasn't long before Roger and his friend were cleared. He had not been stalking Eliza, nor did he harbor ill intent. The call had simply been a prank, and he had a solid alibi for the night of the murders. After that, the list of potential suspects was empty, so law enforcement increased patrols throughout the area. Officers began checking individuals with criminal histories, especially those known for violence against women. They questioned regular customers at the yogurt shop and canvassed the nearby neighborhoods in hopes of uncovering anything new. 8 days later, a witness contacted the police and reported a suspicious 16-year-old boy. He was often seen hanging around the same shopping mall where Amy and Sarah had walked. The teen drew attention because he frequently carried what appeared to be a .22 caliber gun. When he showed up at the mall again, rumors spread quickly that he and his group of friends might somehow be connected to the murders. The new suspect turned out to be a young man named Maurice Pierce, who was frequently accompanied by a friend named Forrest. Indeed been at the same shopping center around the time of the murders and had even stopped by a frozen yogurt shop. This prompted investigators to arrest Maurice, Forrest, and 2 of their friends, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. These 2 had been with the group when they stole the car and left Austin briefly. Police also believed a girl had been with them at some point, so detectives interviewed her as well. All of them were troubled teens who had dropped out of school, though not all had criminal records. None admitted involvement in the murders, but Maurice agreed to cooperate. investigators wired a microphone under his clothing and sent him to speak with Forrest. Later, Forrest said he didn't understand why Maurice was asking incriminating questions and insisted he had simply made a tasteless joke about the murders. After a lengthy investigation, detectives realized they had been misled. Maurice had fabricated much of his story during questioning to appear important. All 4 young men were eventually released, and investigators shifted their focus elsewhere. Because of the severity of the crime, a growing number of witnesses came forward, each with a different account. All were investigated, but none proved reliable. Detectives managed to interview nearly every customer who had visited the yogurt shop that Saturday night. Eventually, a young married couple, Tim and Margaret, came forward. They had purchased yogurt shortly before closing time. While waiting for her order, Margaret noticed 2 men sitting at a nearby table. Their behavior struck her as odd. They sat almost motionless, seemingly listening closely to the girls at the register and behind the counter. Tim and Margaret left shortly after, as the store was preparing to close, but the 2 suspicious men remained inside. Unfortunately, Tim and Margaret couldn't describe them clearly. Their faces weren't visible enough. Hypnosis was even attempted, but it produced no useful results. The police had little information, perhaps because the crime scene was examined by around 100 people, who may have contaminated the area and weakened the integrity of the investigation. Even determining how the fire had been started remained unclear. The most plausible explanation was that the killers had used some kind of accelerant to set the victims on fire. But despite extensive searches and forensic testing, investigators were unable to identify exactly what substance had been used. During this time, the victims' families endured not only the devastation of losing their daughters but also relentless media attention. They faced a painful dilemma. No one wanted to repeatedly revisit the horror of the crime, yet speaking publicly seemed necessary to keep the case alive in the minds of detectives, journalists, and the community. They knew that remaining visible might help push the investigation forward. With no promising suspects in the quadruple homicide, Austin police turned to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for assistance. Investigators then noticed that the stories of Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen, who had previously been pressured during questioning, had changed the most. Their confessions contained numerous inconsistencies. Eventually, after lengthy interrogations, detectives assembled a narrative. Around 11:00 p.m., the 4 girls were preparing to close the yogurt shop, but allowed the remaining young men to finish their food. These young men, according to the confession-based reconstruction, were the killers. The girls locked the doors and flipped the sign, but one of the alleged perpetrators pulled out a gun and aimed it at Eliza at the register. From there, the robbery spiraled out of control. According to the police theory, the girls were brutally assaulted, then shot and burned in an effort to destroy evidence. The trial of Robert and Michael began in 2001. The prosecution relied heavily on their confessions and several witness statements. Meanwhile, the defense emphasized the glaring inaccuracies and procedural violations that tainted the confessions from the very beginning. Beyond those statements, the prosecution had almost no physical evidence conclusively linking the men to the murders. Even so, after several weeks, the jury found both defendants guilty. Springsteen was sentenced to death, and Scott was sentenced to life imprisonment. In 2005, Springsteen, who was 17 at the time, had his sentence commuted to life in prison by Governor Rick Perry as a result of Roper v. Simmons. The defense attorneys argued that neither defendant had the opportunity to commit the crime. Under intense police pressure, the 2 young men had been coerced into incriminating one another, and the defense insisted on exercising their full right to cross-examine every witness the prosecution relied on. Their efforts paid off. They demonstrated that the confessions had been extracted under duress, at gunpoint, on the second day of interrogation. Other law enforcement officers later confirmed this. The video recordings of the interrogations were eventually located and submitted in court. Both Robert and Michael testified that they were beaten, insulted, threatened, and humiliated for days until detectives finally obtained what they wanted: forced confessions to the murders. The prosecution suffered its most serious blow when the defense proved that critical information had been misrepresented at trial. The .22 caliber pistol seized from Maurice had been definitively ruled out as the murder weapon after ballistic testing, yet prosecutors continued claiming in court that it was the gun used to execute the victims. In 2006, an appeals court overturned all charges against Michael Scott. 3 years later, in 2009, Robert Springsteen was also cleared. Both men were freed. Public outrage soon erupted against law enforcement, as it became clear that wrongful convictions were not isolated errors but part of a larger pattern. The scandal triggered internal reviews, renewed scrutiny of interrogation methods, and widespread criticism of practices that had ruined the lives of innocent people. The victims' parents told reporters that they never wanted anyone innocent to go to prison. Revenge was not their goal. They only wanted justice, and for the true killer to be held accountable. Yet the central question remained unanswered: who had murdered the 4 girls? The investigation stalled once again. No new evidence emerged, and the old evidence had failed at every stage. Over the years, technology continued to advance. In 2017, a partial DNA profile was discovered during a reanalysis of samples collected from the victims' bodies. This yielded a partial profile that did not match any of the victims. Only 16 genetic markers were found. This number is alarmingly small, but it's enough to compare with other samples and potentially rule out suspects through comparison. Investigators first compared the sample with the profiles of Forrest, Maurice, Michael, and Robert. All were excluded. None matched the DNA from the crime scene. By the end of 2017, detectives discovered that a nearly identical DNA fragment had been stored in a national database. After further analysis, they learned this same unknown profile had appeared in at least one other unsolved crime in the FBI system. The offender had reoffended, but had never been identified. The investigation remained stuck until the yogurt shop murders resurfaced in the public consciousness. Thanks to documentary filmmakers and the persistence of the victims' families, pressure on the case renewed. Another round of DNA comparisons was conducted, and this time, detectives finally discovered the truth. 2 days after the Austin yogurt shop murders, a man had been arrested in El Paso, Texas, while trying to cross the border into Mexico. He was caught driving a stolen car and carrying a firearm. His name was Robert Eugene Brashers. Investigators later learned that Brashers was a violent serial offender, an abuser and murderer responsible for a string of brutal crimes committed between 1990 and 1998 across multiple states, including Kentucky, Missouri, Texas, and South Carolina. Yet, during his lifetime, he was never openly identified as a suspect in any of these cases. Despite his lengthy criminal record, Brashers' involvement in these crimes only came to light decades after his death. This breakthrough was possible solely because of advances in forensic genetic genealogy. Robert Eugene Brashers was born in Newport News, Virginia, raised in Alabama, later served in the U.S. Army. As a young man, he had no serious criminal history, though he was known to use illegal substances and commit minor offenses. In 1980, he moved to the southern United States and initially appeared to lead an ordinary life. He married, had a daughter, later adopted 2 more girls. However, behind this facade of normalcy was an increasingly unstable and dangerous man. His first abuse occurred in 1985 when he pretended to be intoxicated and attacked Michelle Wilkerson in Florida. He abused her after she attempted to resist, then shot her twice, once in the neck and once in the head. Against all odds, she survived and was able to identify him. Her testimony led to Brashers' arrest and conviction. He received a 12-year prison sentence but was released after just 4 years for good behavior on May 4, 1989. Soon after his release from prison, Brashers quickly returned to criminal behavior. He was arrested several times for robbery, trespassing, and illegal possession of firearms. His instability grew more apparent with each passing year. According to family members, his behavior shifted from unpredictable to openly threatening. Later, his daughter Deborah recalled a disturbing incident. Her father once filmed himself cutting into his own leg with a saw, as if testing how much pain he could endure. It was one of many signs that something was deeply wrong. In January 1999, police finally tracked him to a motel in Missouri, where he was hiding with his wife and daughters. Brashers had been pulled over in connection with a carjacking, but instead of surrendering, he opened fire on law enforcement officers. He then barricaded himself inside the motel room and took his family hostage. Negotiators managed to convince him to release them unharmed, but before officers could make an arrest, Brashers turned the gun on himself. shooting himself in the head. He died 6 days later. Only after his death did investigators begin to connect him to a series of violent crimes. Through the use of genetic genealogy, his DNA was matched to multiple unsolved murders and abuse cases. Evidence linked him to the killings of young women in South Carolina, the 1998 Missouri murders, and a pattern of attacks and abuses in Tennessee. Yet, despite this growing body of evidence, it took decades for detectives to confirm his involvement in one of the most infamous cases in Texas history. It wasn't until 2025 that Austin police finally obtained indisputable proof that Robert Eugene Brashers was responsible for the murders of the 4 teenagers in the yogurt shop in 1991. Advanced DNA testing, combined with modern ballistic analysis of archived evidence, revealed a direct match. The .22 caliber pistol used in the Austin murders turned out to be the same weapon with which Brashers had shot himself during the motel standoff in 1999. When the victims' families learned that the killer had taken his own life decades earlier, some described him as a coward, someone who chose an easy escape rather than facing justice. Detectives also believe he killed himself because he